Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I moved into the new house about 6 months ago. It was a small place, but I was excited to have my own space, especially after years of living in apartments where you could hear every noise your neighbors made. This house was in a quiet neighborhood, tucked away in a cul-de-sac. Perfect, I thought. Just the right amount of privacy without being too isolated. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking and settling in. My street was peaceful. Mostly older folks who kept to themselves, though I hadn't met many of them. It was the kind of place where everyone nodded politely but didn't go out of their way to chat. I noticed him about 2 weeks after moving in. My next-door neighbor. I'd seen him around a few times. He was older, maybe mid-50s, a bit scruffy-looking but nothing too unusual. He kept to himself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Every time I stepped outside, whether it was to grab the mail or to take out the trash, I'd catch him standing at his window, staring. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just curious, or maybe he wasn't even looking at me at all. But then it started happening more frequently. I'd be outside in the garden, and I'd feel eyes on me. Sure enough, there he'd be, peering through his curtains. He never waved or smiled, just stared. It made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. People can be odd, I told myself. No need to overreact. But things escalated. One evening, I was coming back from work, and as I pulled into my driveway, I saw him standing on his front porch, just staring at me. I tried not to make eye contact, but I could feel his gaze follow me as I walked to my door. As soon as I closed it behind me, I checked the window. He was still there, watching. That night, I felt uneasy. Every creak of the house, every sound outside made me jump. I even checked the locks twice before going to bed. The next day, I decided to confront him. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding, and I figured it would be best to clear the air. So, after work, I walked over to his house. My heart was pounding as I knocked on his door. After a few moments, he opened it, standing there with that same blank expression, his eyes boring into me. "Hi, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm your new neighbor," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've noticed you've been watching me, and it's making me a little uncomfortable. I was hoping we could talk about it." He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like he was trying to figure something out. Then, finally, he spoke. "I'm just making sure everything's okay," he said, his voice flat. "I like to keep an eye on things around here." "Right," I replied, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Well, I appreciate that, but it's a bit much. I'd like some privacy, if that's okay." He didn't respond, just continued to stare. I felt my skin crawl. "Okay, well, thanks," I muttered, before quickly walking back to my house. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. In fact, things got worse. The staring didn't stop. In fact, it got more intense. Now, every time I left my house, he was there either standing on his porch or looking through his window. It was unnerving. I stopped spending time in my garden and avoided going outside unless absolutely necessary. Then the notes started. At first, they were just small pieces of paper left on my doorstep. The first one was simple: "I'm watching you." No name, no explanation, just that. I was creeped out, but I told myself it was probably a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The notes kept coming, You can't hide from me. I see everything. I know when you're alone. Each one made my stomach churn. I knew it was him, my neighbor, but I had no proof. I went to the police after the fifth note. They listened politely, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to keep my doors locked and call if anything escalated. It did. One night, I was sitting in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone walking around the side of my house. My heart raced as I crept to the window. Peeking through the blinds, I saw him, my neighbor, standing just a few feet from my window, staring into my house. I backed away, heart pounding. What the hell was he doing? I grabbed my phone and called the police, my hand shaking as I explained that someone was outside my house. They said they'd send a car, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. I told the officers about the notes and how I suspected my neighbor. They checked around the property but found no evidence. Without anything concrete, they couldn't do much. They suggested I get security cameras and told me to call again if anything happened. I installed cameras the next day. I felt a little safer, knowing I'd at least be able to capture proof if he tried anything again. For a while, things were quiet. No more notes, no more strange noises. I started to relax, thinking maybe he finally backed off. But then, one night, I woke up to a notification from my phone. The cameras had detected movement outside. I opened the app, and my blood ran cold. There he was, standing in my backyard, staring directly into the camera. He didn't move, didn't flinch. Just stood there, his face blank, his eyes locked on the lens. I watched, frozen, as he stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally turning and walking away. I called the police again, and this time, they took me seriously. They came and questioned him, but he denied everything. Said he didn't know what I was talking about. Without any concrete proof linking him to the notes or the stalking, they couldn't do much. I was terrified. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Every time I left the house, I felt his eyes on me. I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always watching, always waiting. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my front door handle rattling. I shot out of bed, heart racing, and grabbed my phone. I checked the cameras, and there he was at my front door, trying to get in. I called the police, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial. I could hear him jiggling the handle, and then there was a loud bang, like he was trying to force the door open. The police arrived just as he was about to break in. They arrested him on the spot, and I watched from my window as they led him away in handcuffs. It turned out he had a long history of stalking and harassment. He'd been doing this to women for years, and I was just his latest target. He'd been watching me from the moment I moved in, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I moved out of that house the next week. I couldn't stay there, not after everything that had happened. I still don't feel safe, even in my new place. Every noise, every shadow makes me jump. I keep the cameras up, and I check them constantly, just in case. But no matter where I go, I'll never forget that feeling knowing someone was always watching, always waiting. I was driving back from a long day of work. It was late, probably around midnight, and the road stretched out in front of me, empty and dark. I was tired, but the kind of tired where you can still push through. My eyes were heavy, though, and I'd been staring at the road for so long it started to blur. I just wanted to get home. The highway cut through a lot of farmland, with nothing but fields and the occasional house way off in the distance. There weren't many cars out at that time, which made everything feel even quieter than usual. Then I saw him. standing on the side of the road, just past a broken-down old truck. A guy, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. His thumb was out, signaling he needed a ride. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about him seemed off, not in a bad way, just off. Maybe it was the way he was looking at the road, not at me, but kind of through it, like his mind was somewhere else. I slowed down, not sure why, and pulled over beside him. He walked up to the passenger side window, leaned in, and gave me this tired smile. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him. "Truck broke down," he said, his voice kind of flat. "Been waiting out here for hours. Can you give me a lift to the next town?" I hesitated, but I could see how rough he looked, like he'd been standing there for a while. The road was empty, and it didn't seem like anyone else was coming. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and let him in. He climbed in and buckled up, not saying much at first. I pulled back onto the highway, the sound of the tires humming underneath us. For a while, we didn't talk. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, hands resting on his lap. I was still feeling uneasy, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. He was just a guy trying to get to the next town, I told myself. No big deal. After a few minutes, he broke the silence. "So, where are you headed?" "Home," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Just finished a long day at work." He nodded, still looking out the windshield. "You live around here?" "Not too far," I replied, glancing over at him for a second before returning my eyes to the road. "About an hour or so." "Got family?" That question caught me off guard. It seemed too personal for someone I just picked up. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah, wife and kids," I lied. I didn't have either, but something in my gut told me it was safer to say I wasn't alone. He didn't say anything for a moment, then, "Must be nice, having people waiting for you." I felt a chill crawl up my spine at how he said it. His tone wasn't friendly, more like he was thinking about something else, something darker. I tried to brush it off, but the air in the car felt heavier. "You don't have anyone?" I asked, more out of politeness than curiosity. I was starting to regret picking him up. He chuckled, but it didn't sound right. "Not anymore." I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't want to know. I just focused on the road, counting down the miles until I could drop him off. The sooner he was out of my car, the better. But he kept talking. "You know," he said after a while, "it's strange, being out here in the middle of the night. Feels like you could disappear, and no one would even know." I glanced over at him, but his face was blank, no expression at all. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I forced a laugh, hoping to lighten the mood. "Yeah, I guess it is kinda quiet out here." He turned his head to look at me, and I felt his eyes on the side of my face. "You ever think about that? About how easy it would be to make someone disappear?" I didn't respond. My heart was starting to race, and my mind was screaming at me to get this guy out of my car. Every instinct I had was telling me that something was wrong, but I didn't want to panic. I kept driving, trying to act like his words weren't getting to me. "Look," I said, trying to sound casual, "I can drop you off at the next gas station. It's only a few miles up." He didn't answer at first. Just stared at me with this strange look in his eyes. "You think you're safe, don't you? Just driving along, picking up strangers like it's nothing." My throat tightened, and I forced myself to stay calm. "I'm just trying to help." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "People like you don't usually help people like me." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get him out of the car without making him angry. I could see the gas station up ahead, the bright lights cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "You're not gonna make it to that gas station," he said suddenly, his voice cold and flat. I felt my stomach drop. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us, but the road was still empty. "Excuse me?" I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky. He leaned closer, his breath hot against my neck. I said, "You're not gonna make it to that gas station." I felt panic rising in my chest, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to slam on the brakes, to throw him out of the car, but I couldn't move. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, and I could barely breathe. What do you want?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. He leaned back in his seat, the cold smile still on his face. "I don't want anything. I just like to see how far people go before they break." I slammed on the brakes without thinking, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. My heart was racing, and I could feel sweat dripping down my back. I turned to face him, ready to tell him to get the hell out of my car, but he was already opening the door. He stepped out, casually, like nothing had happened, and leaned down to look at me through the open door. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice calm, almost friendly now. "You should be more careful who you pick up next time." And with that, he shut the door and walked off into the darkness, disappearing into the night. I sat there for what felt like forever, my heart still pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I was just frozen, staring at the spot where he disappeared. Eventually, I pulled myself together and drove the rest of the way home, my hands still shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice. The day had been pretty normal up until the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't ordered anything, but I figured it could be a mistake, maybe something for a neighbor. I opened the door, and there was a delivery guy standing there, holding a brown package. He had on the usual uniform, but something about him felt off right away. He wasn't smiling, not even that polite, forced smile most delivery people give, just staring at me like he was sizing me up. "Delivery for you," he said, his voice low and flat. I frowned and looked down at the package. It had my name and address on it, clear as day, but I hadn't ordered anything. My first instinct was to refuse it, say it wasn't mine, but before I could say anything, he stepped forward, almost too close. "Need me to bring it inside?" he asked, his tone shifting, like he was pushing for something. "No, that's fine," I said quickly, stepping back a bit. "I'll take it from here." I reached out for the package, but he didn't hand it over right away. His grip tightened on the box, holding it just out of my reach, eyes still locked on me. "You sure? It's heavy. Could be something fragile. Wouldn't want you to drop it." I felt a coldness creep into my chest. There was something wrong, something in his eyes. He wasn't looking at me like a delivery person would look at a customer, but more like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't like it. "No, really, I've got it." "Just hand it over," I said, firmer this time, hoping he'd just give me the box and leave. He hesitated for a second, then slowly let go, but his fingers brushed against mine in a way that made my skin crawl. I stepped back again, holding the box in front of me like a shield, and gave him a nod, hoping he'd get the hint to leave. But he didn't move. "You live here alone?" he asked, his eyes drifting over my shoulder into the house behind me. That question sent a jolt of panic through me. Why would he ask that? What kind of delivery person asks that? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. No, I lied. My husband's inside. He's just in the shower. For a split second, his expression changed. There was something dark behind his eyes, but then he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. It was forced, unnatural. Lucky him, he muttered under his breath. I gripped the package tighter, feeling the weight of it now. I just wanted him to leave. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, my instinct screaming at me that something wasn't right. Well, thanks, I said quickly, trying to close the door. I've got it from here. He didn't budge. His hand shot out, stopping the door from closing all the way. My heart skipped a beat as he leaned in, his voice dropping even lower. Sure you don't need help? Won't take but a minute. I felt trapped, the door only half closed, his hand still there, holding it open just enough to stop me from shutting it. My pulse was racing, and my mind was screaming at me to do something, but I was frozen, unsure of how to handle it without making things worse. No, really, I don't need help, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it was shaking. You should go now. For a moment, he just stood there, not moving, not saying anything. The silence stretched on, and I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. Then, slowly, his hand slid off the door, and he took a step back. But the smile on his face stayed. All right, he said, his voice soft but unsettling. If you're sure. I nodded, gripping the door tightly, ready to slam it shut. I watched him turn and walk away, but he didn't go far. He stopped at the bottom of my driveway, just standing there, looking back at the house. I slammed the door shut, locking it immediately, my hand shaking. I backed away from the door, trying to catch my breath. Something was very wrong. I could feel it in my bones. I didn't know what he wanted, but I wasn't about to find out. I peeked through the blinds, my heart racing as I watched him standing there, still looking at the house. He wasn't leaving. He was just watching. My mind raced with what to do. Call the police. It felt extreme, but every part of me was screaming that I was in danger. As I stood there, the box still in my arms, I realized I hadn't even looked at what was inside. I put it down on the table and grabbed a knife, cutting through the tape as fast as I could, my hand shaking the whole time. I tore the flaps open, and what I saw inside made my stomach drop. It wasn't something fragile or valuable. It wasn't even something personal. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words scrawled across it in messy handwriting. See you soon. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back from the table, nearly dropping the paper. My mind was racing. Who had sent this? Was it him? Was he still out there? I ran to the window and pulled the blinds aside again, my heart pounding. The driveway was empty. He was gone. But I knew he wasn't really gone. He'd be back. I could feel it. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I told them what had happened. They said they'd send someone to check the area, but I could tell by the tone of the dispatcher's voice that they didn't think it was serious. Just some delivery guy, they probably thought. But I knew it wasn't that simple. I knew I wasn't safe. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting by the front door with a chair pushed under the knob and every light in the house on. Every little sound outside made me jump, my mind playing tricks on me, thinking he was out there, watching, waiting. The police never found him. They said they'd keep an eye on the neighborhood, but that didn't make me feel any better. I knew he was still out there. I didn't know when or how, but I knew he'd come back. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. I started carrying pepper spray in my pocket, double-checking the locks on every door and window. But the worst part was the nights. I couldn't sleep, not really. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks and taps that I convinced myself were just the house settling. But in the back of my mind, I knew better. It started like any other night. I was working late again and missed the last few regular trains. It wasn't unusual for me to catch the late subway, so I wasn't too worried. There's this weird stillness that comes with the late night rides, no chatter, no crowds, just the hum of the train moving through the tunnels. Most people don't like it, but I've always found it kind of peaceful. That night, though, something felt off the moment I stepped onto the platform. It was empty, completely empty. Not a single person around. I shrugged it off. It was late, after all. I figured I'd probably have the whole train to myself, which was fine by me. The train rolled in after a few minutes, and when the doors slid open, I stepped into the carriage. Sure enough, no one else was inside. I took a seat near the middle, across from the door, and settled in for the ride home. I wasn't paying much attention at first, just scrolling through my phone, but after a couple of stops, I started to feel, I don't know, uneasy. The train kept moving, but there was no sign of any other passengers, not even the usual late-night stragglers. It was weird, but I figured maybe it was just a quiet night. Then, at the next stop, the doors opened, and a man got on. I remember the first thing I noticed about him was his clothes. He was dressed in a suit, but it was all wrinkled and disheveled, like he'd been wearing it for days. He didn't carry a briefcase or anything, just his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He walked slowly, almost too slowly, like he didn't have anywhere to be. He didn't sit down. He just stood by the door, holding onto the pole, staring straight ahead. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after a while, I noticed he wasn't looking around, not checking his phone, nothing. Just standing there, staring. I kept my head down, trying to ignore him, but after a few minutes, I could feel his eyes on me. You know that feeling, when you just know someone's watching you? I glanced up, and sure enough, he was staring right at me. Not blinking, not looking away, just staring. It made my skin crawl. I looked back down at my phone, pretending like I didn't notice, but he didn't stop. Every time I glanced up, his eyes were still locked on me. It wasn't just a casual glance either. It felt deliberate, like he was waiting for something. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just tired, maybe he was zoning out. But the longer it went on, the more I started to freak out. There was something in the way he was watching me, something that didn't feel right. Then, at the next stop, the doors opened again, but no one else got on. The man didn't move. He just stayed there, still staring. I looked around, expecting to see the conductor or someone else, but the platform was empty. I shifted in my seat, trying to get comfortable, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. I don't know why, but suddenly I realized I hadn't seen the conductor at all since I got on. Normally, you'd hear the announcements or see them walking through the cars, but there was nothing. The silence was heavy. Too heavy. I stood up, figuring I'd just move to another car, put some distance between me and the staring guy. But when I walked toward the door at the end of the carriage, it didn't open. I pressed the button, but nothing happened. The door stayed shut. I looked through the glass, and the next car was dark, completely dark. I turned back to my seat, trying to stay calm, but when I looked up, the man had moved. He was sitting in the seat directly across from mine now. I didn't even hear him get up. He was still staring, only now there was this strange, almost amused look on his face. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me, like I was something he couldn't quite figure out. The train kept moving, but it felt like time had stopped. I was stuck in this car with him, the lights flickering every now and then, the whole space feeling smaller and smaller. I glanced at the emergency intercom, wondering if I should press it, but something told me it wouldn't do any good. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I could feel the sweat building on the back of my neck, my hands starting to shake. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "You going somewhere?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost like a whisper. I froze. His question hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. The way he said it, it wasn't normal. It was like he already knew the answer, like he knew I couldn't leave. I swallowed hard and took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer again, just smiled this slow, creepy smile, like he was enjoying watching me squirm. I backed up until I was pressed against the door, wishing it would open, wishing I could just get out of there. But the train kept going, and so did he. "You shouldn't be out so late," he said, his tone casual, like he was making small talk. "Not alone." I could feel my pulse racing. The exits were locked. No one else was on the train. I was completely alone with this guy, and he knew it. I reached into my pocket, grabbing my phone, but the second I did, his smile disappeared. He stood up, taking a step toward me, his whole posture changing. "You're not calling anyone," he said, his voice suddenly sharp, cold. "Put the phone away." My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, my mind scrambling to figure out what to do. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The train slowed down as we approached another station. I prayed anyone would get on, but when the doors opened, the platform was empty again. No conductor, no passengers, just an eerie silence that made my heart sink. I made a split-second decision. As soon as the doors opened, I darted for them, sprinting out onto the platform. I didn't care where I was, I just needed to get off that train, away from him. I ran down the platform, looking for an exit, but it was late, and most of the station was closed off. My footsteps echoed in the empty space, the sound bouncing off the walls, making me feel even more exposed. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see him following me, but he wasn't there. The train was still sitting at the platform, the doors wide open, but the man hadn't moved. He was just standing there, watching me from inside the train, that eerie smile back on his face. For a moment, I thought about running back and pressing the emergency button, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to get any closer to him. I just needed to get out, get away. Finally, I found an exit and bolted up the stairs, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the street, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop running. I didn't stop until I was blocks away, breathing hard, my mind still racing. I never saw him again, but for weeks after, I couldn't help but feel that he was still watching me. I was driving back from a weekend trip. It was late, much later than I had planned to be on the road. I'd gotten lost earlier, which pushed everything back, and by the time I found my way again, it was almost pitch black. My GPS wasn't doing much to help either, losing signal every few minutes. I didn't want to stop, though. The road I was on was remote, no other cars, No lights except my own headlights, and nothing around but trees. Endless trees. It had been like that for the past hour. Just me and the road. I hadn't seen any signs or houses or even gas stations in a long time, which was starting to make me nervous. I was in the middle of nowhere, and the thought of breaking down out here was in the back of my mind. But the car was running fine, so I kept going, figuring I'd hit something eventually, a town, a rest stop, anything. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, the way the headlights hit something up ahead, but as I got closer, I realized it was real. There was something blocking the road. Not a full-on barricade or anything official, just a few orange cones set up in a line and what looked like a piece of wood lying across the road. It was weird. There weren't any signs or warning lights or anything like that, just those cones in the wood. I slowed down, trying to figure out what it was about. The cones weren't spread out too far, so I thought maybe I could just go around them. But right as I was thinking that, two men stepped out from behind a tree on the side of the road. I wasn't expecting that. They didn't have reflective vests or anything like that, nothing that would make them look like they were supposed to be there. Just regular clothes, jeans, jackets, and boots. One of them had a cap pulled low over his face, and the other had his hood up. They walked over toward the front of my car, and my heart started to race. I rolled down my window just a crack, enough to talk but not enough for them to reach in. My hands were gripping the steering wheel, and I could feel the sweat starting to build up in my palms. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound calm, even though my gut was telling me something wasn't right. The guy with the hood on leaned down so his face was level with my window. He gave me a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there," he said. "Just a little roadblock. We're doing some work up ahead." I glanced past him, down the road. It was completely dark, nothing but trees. No lights, no signs of construction, nothing. Just the road disappearing into the woods. "What kind of work?" I asked, my voice coming out a little shakier than I wanted. "Tree clearing," the other guy answered. He was standing back a bit, closer to the cones, just watching me. He had his hands in his pockets, but something about the way he stood, the way he was watching, it didn't feel right. "Can I go around?" I asked, eyeing the cones. It didn't look like they were set up too tightly. I could probably squeeze by if I had to. The guy with the hood smiled again, that same smile that made my skin crawl. "No need for that," he said. "We'll move everything for you. Just give us a minute." I watched as he walked over to the piece of wood in the road and bent down like he was going to pick it up. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. It wasn't a piece of wood. It was a long, flat board with nails sticking out of it, the kind they used to puncture tires. And the guy wasn't moving it out of the way. He was adjusting it, making sure it was lined up perfectly with my tires. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I glanced at the guy near the cones. His hand was out of his pocket, and he was holding something, a crowbar. He wasn't even trying to hide it. I realized what was happening, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let them trap me. Without thinking, I slammed the car into reverse and hit the gas. The tires screeched as I backed up, and I could see the guy with the crowbar start to move toward me, but I didn't give him a chance. I whipped the wheel around, turning the car to the side, and floored it. The car shot forward, bouncing over the edge of the road and onto the shoulder. I could hear the scraping of branches against the side of the car, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I heard one of the men shout something, but I didn't stop to listen. My heart was racing, and I could feel the panic setting in. I was back on the road now, speeding past the cones and the men, the dark trees rushing by on either side of me. I didn't look back. I drove for what felt like forever, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, but there was nothing. Just the darkness. Eventually, I came across a small town, a few houses, a gas station, and a diner. I pulled into the gas station, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were shaking. After a while, I went into the diner and asked the guy behind the counter if there were any roadworks or tree clearing happening on the road I had just come from. He gave me a confused look and shook his head. "No," he said. "There's nothing out there but woods. No construction this time of year." I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell anyone. I just filled up my car and kept driving, sticking to the main roads this time. I don't know what those men were planning, but I know one thing for sure: they weren't there to help. I'd known Kyle for a few years, mostly from work stuff. We weren't close, but we got along fine when we had to. He mentioned he had a friend, Mike, who was passing through the area and needed a place to crash for the weekend. Since I'd be at my cabin anyway, I figured it wouldn't be a big deal. I didn't know Mike personally, but Kyle vouched for him, so I agreed. It was a remote cabin, about 2 hours from town, and I spent most weekends there. It was my spot to unwind, and I didn't mind having some company for a couple of days. Mike showed up late Friday night. I'd already been up there since the afternoon, chopping wood and setting up the fire. The sun had gone down by the time he arrived, and I could hear his car coming up the dirt road long before he got to the driveway. When he finally pulled in, his headlights were the only thing cutting through the dark. He stepped out of the car, tall and lanky, with a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. His clothes were worn, a little too big for him, and his eyes darted around like he wasn't comfortable standing still. There was something about him that immediately put me on edge, but I brushed it off. People were different in the city than out here in the woods, I told myself. He was probably just tired from the drive. "Hey, man, thanks for letting me stay," Mike said, shaking my hand. His grip was strong, maybe a little too strong, but I ignored it. "Kyle speaks highly of you." "No problem," I said, leading him toward the cabin. "Place isn't much, but it's quiet." We made some small talk while I showed him around. The cabin wasn't big, just 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area with a wood stove. I offered him a beer, and we sat outside by the fire pit. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you could hear the wind in the trees and nothing else. Mike seemed to relax a bit, but there was still something off about him. He kept looking around, his eyes never staying in one place for long. We talked about work for a while, and then the conversation shifted to other things. That's when Mike started telling stories. "You ever been in a fight?" he asked, out of nowhere. I shook my head. "Not really, no." "I have," he said, a strange smile creeping across his face. "A few, actually. You wouldn't believe some of the shit I've been through." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and took a sip of my beer, hoping he'd change the subject. But he didn't. "One time, I was at this bar, right? Some guy starts mouthing off, saying shit to me. I wasn't even doing anything, just minding my own business. But he wouldn't stop. So, I got up, walked over to him, and he made a motion like he was punching someone, his fist swinging through the air. Knocked him out cold. Didn't even see it coming. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I forced a smile, feeling more uncomfortable by the minute. The fire crackled between us, the only sound for a few seconds. Mike took a long swig of his beer and leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. You ever hurt someone? Like, really hurt someone? My stomach twisted. No. Never. He nodded, like he was expecting that answer. Yeah, most people haven't. But sometimes you don't have a choice, you know? People push you, and you gotta push back. I didn't like where the conversation was going. I tried to steer it in another direction, asked him about his drive, about Kyle, anything to get him off the subject of violence. But every time, he'd circle back to it. He told me another story about a fight he got into, this one at a gas station. Then another, about some guy who cut him off on the highway. It's always the same, he said, his voice lower now, more serious. People think they can mess with you, treat you like shit, until you show them they're wrong. Sometimes, that's the only way they'll learn. I nodded again, my throat dry. I was regretting letting him stay, but it was too late now. It wasn't like I could ask him to leave in the middle of the night. We were miles from town, and there was no cell service out here. If things went bad, there'd be no one to call for help. The thought of that hit me hard. I felt trapped. As the night wore on, Mike's stories got worse. He talked about fights that didn't sound like fights anymore, more like attacks. He described things in detail, things I didn't want to hear. The way he'd beaten someone, how much blood there was, how the guy didn't get back up. He spoke like it was normal, like it didn't bother him at all. But it bothered me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. Every time Mike got up to grab another beer or stoke the fire, I found myself tensing up, my mind racing through scenarios. What if he snapped? What if one of those stories wasn't in the past, but something he was planning to do? I started thinking about the cabin, about the knife I kept in the kitchen drawer. I didn't want to have to use it, but I needed to know where it was, just in case. At one point, Mike got real quiet. He was just staring into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes. The air had gotten colder, and I could feel the weight of the night settling in. My gut told me to call it a night, to get inside and lock the door. But before I could say anything, Mike spoke again. You know, he said, not looking at me, sometimes I wonder what it'd be like if someone didn't make it out. I didn't respond. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic creeping in. I wanted to get away from him, to get inside the cabin where I could lock the door and put some space between us. But I didn't want to set him off. I didn't know what he was capable of, and I wasn't about to find out. I stood up slowly, trying to act casual. I think I'm gonna head to bed, I said, my voice steady even though my insides were twisting with fear. Long day tomorrow. Mike didn't move for a second. Then he looked up at me, that strange smile on his face again. Yeah, he said. Probably a good idea. I walked inside, my hand shaking as I turned the knob on the door. I closed it behind me, listening to the sound of the lock clicking into place. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the knife in the kitchen. I grabbed it and kept it close as I headed to my room, leaving the lights on. The cabin felt different now, like the walls were closing in. Every noise made me jump. I sat on the bed, my back against the wall, the knife in my lap, listening for any sound from outside. But nothing happened. Mike didn't knock on the door, didn't try to come in. He stayed outside by the fire for a long time. I could see his shadow through the window, just sitting there, staring into the flames. Eventually, the fire died down, and I heard him get up and go to the guest room. I didn't sleep that night. I kept my eyes on the door, waiting, listening for any sign that he was coming for me. But morning came, and nothing happened. Mike packed up his stuff and left without saying much. Just a thanks for letting me stay, and that same unsettling smile. I watched him drive away, my hands still shaking. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I went to the grocery store that night because I had run out of milk, and I didn't want to make breakfast without it the next morning. It was already dark by the time I pulled into the parking lot, but the store was well lit, and there were a few other cars scattered around. I didn't think twice about it. It was supposed to be a quick in and out trip. The moment I stepped inside, I grabbed a cart and headed straight for the dairy aisle. As I pushed my way through, I noticed two men standing near the entrance. They weren't shopping. They were just standing there, not talking to each other, not doing anything. Just looking around, kind of aimlessly. I brushed it off. People loiter in grocery stores all the time. I grabbed the milk and started back toward the front. I passed them again, this time making brief eye contact with one of them. He was tall, maybe in his late 30s, wearing a hoodie and jeans. The other one was shorter, stockier, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. They didn't seem out of place exactly, but there was something odd about the way they were standing so still, not really shopping. I shrugged it off, figuring they were just waiting for someone or maybe taking a break from walking around. I made my way to the frozen food section to grab a few other things I needed. As I turned down the aisle, I glanced behind me, and they were still there. They hadn't moved, but now both of them were watching me. I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't like they were hiding it. They were openly staring at me, and it didn't make any sense. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence that they seemed to look every time I did. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to ignore them and kept shopping, pushing my cart faster, grabbing things without really paying attention to what I was doing. But the whole time, I felt them watching. I couldn't shake it. When I made my way to the checkout line, I looked over my shoulder again. They were gone. My heart eased a little. I checked out and headed for the exit, carrying my bags in both hands. The air outside was cooler than it had been when I went in, and the parking lot was even more empty. My car was parked toward the back, under one of the streetlights. I quickened my pace, feeling relieved to be out of the store. But as I got closer to my car, I heard footsteps. Not quick or hurried, just steady, deliberate footsteps. I glanced behind me, and there they were, the same two men from inside the store. They weren't walking fast, but they were walking toward me, keeping their eyes on me. I froze for a second, trying to figure out if they were just heading to their own car, maybe parked near mine. But as I kept walking, they kept following. My heart started pounding. I told myself not to panic, but the distance between us was closing, and I could hear their footsteps getting louder. I got to my car, fumbled with my keys, and dropped them. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold onto my groceries. "Hey," one of them called out from behind me. It was the taller one, his voice low and calm. "Hold up." I didn't look at them. I just wanted to get in my car and drive away. But before I could, they were right there, standing next to me. "Did you take something?" the tall one asked, his tone casual but firm. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "What?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The shorter one stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You took something. We saw you in the store." My mind raced. I hadn't taken anything. I paid for my groceries like normal. What were they talking about? "I didn't take anything," I said, trying to stay calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." They didn't back off. The tall one leaned in slightly, his expression unreadable. "We saw you," he said again. "You took something from us." I was panicking now. What were they accusing me of? I hadn't spoken to anyone in the store, hadn't bumped into anyone. I didn't even know who they were. "I didn't take anything," I repeated, my voice shaking. "You've got the wrong person." The shorter one stepped even closer, so close I could smell the cigarette smoke on his breath. "You sure about that?" he asked, his voice menacing now. I backed up, feeling the edge of my car pressing against my back. My mind was spinning, trying to figure out how to get out of this. I looked around, but there was no one else in the parking lot. The streetlights felt too far away, the store too distant. It was just me and these two men, and they weren't letting up. "I didn't take anything," I said again, louder this time, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The taller one exchanged a look with the shorter guy, and for a moment I thought they might leave me alone. But then the shorter one reached out and grabbed my arm. "Let's check your bags," he said, yanking me toward him. "No!" I pulled away, panic surging through me. "Let go of me." But he didn't. He held on tighter, his fingers digging into my arm. I tried to twist away, but he was stronger than me. I could feel my breath coming faster, my chest tightening as fear took over. The taller man stepped forward, blocking my path to the driver's door. "You should just cooperate," he said calmly, like it was no big deal. I felt trapped. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to do something, anything, to get away. My keys were still in my hand, and without thinking, I swung my arm up, slashing the key across the shorter guy's face. He let go of me, cursing loudly as he stumbled back, clutching his cheek. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I yanked the car door open and jumped in, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key into the ignition. The taller guy was pounding on the window now, shouting something I couldn't hear through the glass. Finally, the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse and sped out of the parking lot, not even looking back. My heart was still racing as I drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. I didn't stop until I was halfway home, pulled over on the side of the road, and sat there for a while, just trying to breathe. I don't know what those men wanted. I don't know what they thought I took, or if they were just trying to scare me. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before. They were following me, waiting for me, and they weren't going to let me leave until I gave them something I didn't have. It was a Thursday night, around 9 p.m., when I went out for a run in the park. I usually jog during the day, but my work schedule had been crazy that week. The park is big, with winding paths, small wooded areas, and a lake in the middle. It's usually packed during the day, but by this time of night, it was practically deserted. That's why I liked it peaceful, quiet. Just me, the sound of my feet hitting the pavement, and the cool breeze. I had my earbuds in, listening to some music, nothing too loud, just enough to keep me in rhythm. I started my usual route, going around the lake first, then cutting through the trees before looping back around. The streetlights along the path flickered a bit, but most of them worked fine. It wasn't pitch black, but it was dark enough to make everything feel a little isolated. About 10 minutes into my run, I saw someone ahead of me on the path. They were jogging too, just a little ways off, maybe 50 yards or so. It wasn't unusual to see someone else out for a night run, but something about the way they moved caught my attention. Their pace was steady, like mine, and they were wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up, even though it wasn't that cold. I shrugged it off. People wear all kinds of things when they run. I slowed down a bit, giving them more space ahead of me, just to avoid the awkwardness of getting too close. But as I kept going, I noticed they weren't pulling ahead anymore. They were running the same pace as me. I glanced at my watch to check my time. I hadn't slowed down that much. In fact, it seemed like they were intentionally matching my speed. It was probably just a coincidence. The path curved around the lake, and I figured they'd keep going straight, or maybe turn off toward the parking lot, but they didn't. They followed the exact curve of the path, just like I did. Every twist and bend, they were there, about the same distance ahead. I shook off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. There's no way they were following me. This was a public park, and we were both just running. But as we approached the fork in the path, I usually took the left route, the one that went deeper into the wooded area. Most people avoided it at night because it wasn't as well lit. Without thinking, I veered left. They did too. That's when I really started to notice it. The way they ran, it wasn't relaxed. It was like they were waiting for me to do something, for me to change my pace or my direction. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I tried to keep calm, told myself it was all in my head. Maybe they always took this route. Maybe they were just running at the same time as me. Coincidences happen, right? But I couldn't shake it. My heartbeat picked up, not from the run but from something else, something that felt off. I decided to test it. I slowed down to a jog, almost to a walk. And they slowed down too. I felt a cold sweat forming on my neck. I was being followed. I was sure of it now. I didn't want to stop. Stopping felt like the worst idea. So I sped up again, trying to act like nothing was wrong, trying to act like I wasn't freaked out. I didn't want them to know I'd noticed. I kept my eyes forward, but I could feel them there, getting closer. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look over my shoulder without making it obvious. They were closing the distance, bit by bit, no longer keeping their distance. I couldn't make out their face, not with the hood up, but I could see their legs pumping faster, their arms swinging in time with mine. They weren't just running. They were running toward me. I felt my stomach drop. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to panic, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, to run fast. But if I ran, would they run too? Would they catch up? I couldn't think straight. All I knew was I had to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The path was empty, and the wooded area was thick on both sides. There wasn't a house or a person nearby, just trees and darkness. I could barely hear my own breathing over the pounding of my heart. I picked up my pace, my feet slamming harder against the pavement. I didn't care anymore if they knew I was scared. I just wanted to put as much distance between us as possible. I pushed harder, sprinting now, hoping maybe I could outrun them, lose them around the next bend. But when I glanced back again, they were right there, closer than before. No more than 20 yards behind me. They weren't trying to hide it anymore. They were chasing me. My lungs burned as I ran, my legs aching with every step, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know who they were, what they wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I kept running, pushing myself harder than I ever had before. The path twisted and turned through the trees, and I could barely see the lights ahead anymore. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps right behind me. Fast, heavy footsteps. They weren't just following me. They were sprinting after me, gaining ground. I made a split-second decision. Instead of staying on the path, I veered off into the trees, hoping to lose them in the woods. The branches scraped against my arms and face as I crashed through the underbrush, stumbling over roots and rocks, but I didn't stop. I kept going, weaving through the trees, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. The footsteps behind me slowed for a moment, like they weren't sure where I'd gone. I crouched behind a tree, trying to catch my breath, trying to quiet the sound of my pounding heart. I couldn't hear them anymore. Maybe I'd lost them. Maybe they had given up. But then, I heard it, a voice. Low, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere behind me. Where are you? My blood ran cold. They were still there, still looking for me. I pressed myself tighter against the tree, barely breathing. The voice came again, closer this time. Come on, I know you're here. I felt sick. My muscles were burning, my mind racing. I couldn't stay hidden forever. They were getting closer, searching the woods. I had to make a move, but every step I took felt like it would give me away. I waited, listening for the footsteps, the voice. They were further away now, but still searching. I took a deep breath and bolted, running as fast as I could in the opposite direction, hoping I could make it back to the main path, back to where there might be other people. I crashed through the trees, barely able to see where I was going. I stumbled, almost falling, but I kept going, pushing through the pain, through the fear. I could hear them behind me again, running, getting closer. I wasn't fast enough. The path was just ahead. I could see the lights through the trees. If I could just make it to the path, I'd be safe. I could get to the road, to my car, to safety. I burst out of the trees and onto the path, my legs barely holding me up. I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. I just ran, faster than I ever thought I could. I made it to the parking lot, my car in sight. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. I got the door open, jumped inside, and slammed it shut. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart racing, my body trembling. I looked around, but the parking lot was empty. There was no sign of them. I don't know who they were, or why they were chasing me. I don't know what would have happened if they caught me. But I don't run in that park anymore. I don't go out at night. I don't know if they're still out there, looking for someone else. But I won't be around to find out. I had been driving for hours, probably close to 10, and was so tired that the lines on the road started to blur together. It was late, past midnight, and I'd been meaning to pull over and find a place to stop, but every motel I passed looked worse than the last, and the gas stations were either closed or just didn't feel safe. I was in the middle of nowhere, far enough from home but still a long way from where I was going. My gas tank was getting low, and the dashboard light blinked on, which made me nervous. The only thing around for miles were these rundown-looking places on the side of the road. I saw a neon sign glowing ahead, half of it burned out, but I could make out the word bar in flickering red letters. It looked like one of those places truckers might stop, tucked away off the highway, nothing fancy. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have much choice. I pulled into the gravel lot, parked near the front where there was just one other car, an old pickup that looked like it had seen better days. The place wasn't big, just a low building with a few windows, all dark inside except for a dim light coming from the front. I figured I could grab something quick to eat, maybe get some directions, and get back on the road. I didn't plan on staying long. When I walked inside, the door creaked loudly behind me, and I instantly regretted it. The bar was small, just a handful of tables and a long counter at the back. A jukebox in the corner played a slow country song that barely covered the silence. There were a few people scattered around, sitting at tables, all of them older men, maybe in their 50s or 60s. The place smelled like stale beer and something fried. As soon as I stepped in, every head in the room turned to look at me. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, but it did. Their eyes followed me as I walked over to the bar and sat on one of the stools. The bartender, a guy with a graying beard and a stained apron, came over slowly. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for a second, wiping his hands on a rag. Can I get a water?" I asked, trying to be polite, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. He gave me a nod, still watching me like I didn't belong there, which, to be fair, I didn't. But I wasn't looking for trouble, just trying to make it through the night. He poured the water and set it in front of me. I thanked him, but he didn't respond, just kept staring. I could feel the eyes of the men behind me, still watching, still too quiet. I pulled out my phone to check the map, hoping there'd be something nearby, maybe a town, a gas station. But the signal was weak, and I couldn't get anything to load. I felt the anxiety creeping up, a sense that I was stuck. One of the men at a nearby table stood up and walked over, pulling out the stool next to me. He didn't ask if it was taken, just sat down like it was no big deal. He was tall, heavy-set, with a big belly and a worn-out flannel shirt. His breath smelled like cigarettes. "You're not from around here, are you?" he said, grinning. "No," I said, trying to keep it short. "Just passing through." "Passing through," he repeated, like he was thinking about it. "Ain't many people around here just pass through. You got family nearby?" "No," I said, not wanting to give him more than that. "Just heading somewhere. Long drive." He didn't take the hint. He just kept smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was more like he was amused by me. I glanced at the bartender, hoping maybe he'd step in, but he was just watching too, like he was in on the joke. "Where you headed to?" the man asked, leaning closer. His voice was quieter now, like he didn't want the others to hear, even though they were still watching, listening. I didn't want to tell him anything. "Just a long drive," I repeated, hoping that'd end the conversation. He didn't move. "You don't want to be out there on the road all night," he said. "It gets dark out there, you know. Lots of accidents happen. You might want to stick around here for a bit." "I'll be fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just needed a break." The smile faded from his face. His eyes narrowed a little, like he didn't like my answer. He glanced over his shoulder at the other men, then back at me. "You sure about that?" My stomach dropped. Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. I stood up, grabbing my bag off the stool. "I should get going," I said, turning toward the door. But he grabbed my arm, just lightly, but enough to make me stop. "Hold on now," he said. "We're just being friendly. No need to rush off." My heart started pounding. I pulled my arm back, stepping away from him. "I'm leaving," I said, louder this time, hoping maybe someone outside would hear me, but there was no one. The bartender finally spoke. "You might want to listen to him," he said, his voice low and slow. "Ain't safe out there for a lady by herself this time of night." I felt trapped. The door was only a few feet away, but it felt miles from where I was standing. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I could feel the tension in the air, like something bad was about to happen. The man stood up too, blocking my path. "Why don't you stay a while?" he said. "We'll keep you company." I took a step back, feeling my hands start to shake. "I don't want any trouble," I said. His smile came back, but this time it was different. It was cold. "Neither do we," he said. "But you're already here. Might as well enjoy yourself." I glanced around the room, trying to find another exit, but there wasn't one. Just the door behind him. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of there. "Look," I said, trying to keep calm. "I'm just gonna go. Thanks for the water." But he didn't move. The bartender stepped out from behind the counter, and I realized they weren't going to let me leave, not without a fight. I took a deep breath and did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't wait for them to stop me. I just pushed past him, slamming into the door and bursting out into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with my keys, praying they wouldn't follow. I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, fast. I could hear the man shouting something, but I didn't stop to listen. I got to my car, yanked the door open, and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as he reached the door. He pounded on the window, shouting at me, but I jammed the key into the ignition and peeled out of the lot, gravel flying under my tires. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart racing. I drove for miles before I finally slowed down, my pulse still pounding in my ears. I don't know what they wanted from me, and I don't care. I was just glad I got out of there. But I haven't stopped at a roadside bar since, and I don't plan to ever again. It was one of those quiet nights, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. I had just settled into my recliner with a book, the dim light casting shadows in the corners of my living room. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but everything felt safe, normal. I lived alone in a small house at the end of a long street, far enough away from neighbors that I rarely saw anyone. Around 10 o'clock, I heard it. A soft knock at the door. At first, I thought maybe I imagined it. I sat still, listening. The knock came again, a bit louder this time. I didn't recognize the sound, which made my heart beat just a little faster. I set my book down, trying to shake off the unease creeping in. I peeked through the peephole. 3 figures stood on my porch, their faces obscured by the darkness. I couldn't see their features, just the outline of their bodies. My first instinct was to ignore it. It was late, and I didn't want to open the door to anyone I didn't know. But the knocking persisted, accompanied by muffled voices. "Please. We need help," a woman's voice called out. "Our car broke down. Can you let us in?" Something about the way she sounded felt urgent, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind told me to be cautious. Still, it was hard to ignore the plea for help. I took a deep breath, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I opened the door just a crack, enough to see them better. 2 men flanked the woman, both looking disheveled and slightly out of breath. One of the men stepped forward. "We're really stuck. We just need to use your phone, and we'll be out of your hair in no time." I hesitated, weighing my options. It was late, and I didn't want to be rude. "Where's your car?" I asked. "It's just down the road." "We didn't want to leave it unattended," the woman said, her eyes pleading. "Please, we're really in a bind." Against my better judgment, I opened the door wider and stepped back. "Okay, come in. But just for a moment." As they entered, I quickly scanned them for anything suspicious. They looked harmless enough, but my instincts were still on high alert. The woman smiled appreciatively. "Thank you so much. We really appreciate it." Once inside, the atmosphere shifted. The 2 men exchanged glances, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where's your phone?" one of them asked, a little too quickly. "Ah, it's in the kitchen," I said, pointing down the hall. "Just down there." They didn't move toward the kitchen. Instead, They formed a loose circle in the living room, almost like they were blocking my exit. I felt the first stirrings of panic. "Why don't you just wait here? I'll grab it for you." The woman stepped closer, her smile fading. "Actually, we think it's better if we all stay together. You understand, right? It's late, and we wouldn't want any misunderstandings." My mind raced as I started to grasp what was happening. They weren't here for help. They had their own agenda. I glanced toward the front door, calculating my chances of making it out. "Listen, I think you should leave," I said, my voice firmer now. "I can't help you. You should really go." The men's faces hardened, and the woman's expression shifted to something more sinister. "Oh, come on now," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're not here to hurt you. We just want to make sure you don't get any funny ideas." The tension in the room thickened, and I could feel the air grow heavy. I stepped back, trying to find an escape route, my mind racing. They were blocking the door, and I had no idea if they were armed. I needed to think quickly. "Let's not make this difficult," one of the men said, stepping closer. "Just do what we say, and we can all walk away from this." I swallowed hard, adrenaline pumping through my veins. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, keeping my eyes on their movements. "Just a little help from a nice guy like you," the woman said, her voice suddenly cold. "But if you make this hard for us, things might get out of hand." I glanced around the room, my heart racing. My phone was still in the kitchen, but I couldn't risk making a run for it. Instead, I acted on instinct. I turned and bolted toward the back of the house, hoping to find a way to escape. "Hey!" I heard them shout, but I didn't stop. I ran through the kitchen, throwing the door to the backyard open. I stumbled out into the night, my feet hitting the grass as I sprinted for the fence. I could hear their footsteps behind me, fast and heavy. I reached the fence and climbed, desperate to get over. I didn't look back. I landed hard on the other side and kept running, not stopping until I reached the street. I turned and ran down the road, my heart pounding in my ears. I saw headlights in the distance and sprinted toward them, waving my arms as I ran. A car slowed, and I could see a couple inside, their expressions shifting from confusion to concern. "Help! Please!" I shouted, running to the driver's side. "They're after me." The driver's eyes widened, and he unlocked the doors as I jumped inside, slamming the door shut behind me. "What happened?" he asked, looking past me. "Just drive. Go!" I yelled, my voice raw with fear. The car sped away, and I glanced back to see the figures standing at the fence, watching me disappear into the night. I took a deep breath, my heart still racing. I was out, but the fear lingered like a shadow, reminding me of how quickly things could change. I didn't look back until I was safely in a well-lit area, and even then, I still felt their eyes on me. It was a night I wouldn't forget, a lesson learned about trusting my instincts. From that night on, I never opened my door without knowing exactly who was on the other side. When I first moved into the apartment, it felt like a dream come true. It was this old building, charming in that kind of way where you know it had a history. The rent was way cheaper than what you'd expect for a place that nice, and even though it was on the edge of the city, I didn't mind the commute. It had this vintage look with high ceilings, creaky wood floors, and these tall windows that let in a lot of light during the day. I thought I'd hit the jackpot. I didn't even notice the basement door the first time I saw the place. I'd walked right past it during the showing, more focused on the layout of the apartment itself. It was tucked away in the hallway, near the back where you'd hardly pay attention. It wasn't until a few days after I'd moved in that I saw it. The door was old, like everything else in the building, painted the same off-white color as the walls. The doorknob looked worn, like it had been used 1,000 times. At first, I figured it was just a storage space. I thought about asking the landlord, but I shrugged it off. I didn't think much of it until I noticed that sometimes, late at night, I'd hear noises. Nothing loud, just faint sounds, like someone moving around down there. The first time I heard it, I thought it might be pipes or something. Old buildings always had their quirks. But it kept happening, and it started to feel too regular. Like footsteps, soft but steady. One night, I couldn't help it anymore. Curiosity got the better of me, so I opened the door. The hinges squeaked as I pulled it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. It was dark, colder than I expected. I flicked on the light switch, but the bulb down there was dim, barely lighting the steps. I stood there for a second, debating whether to go down or not. But I didn't. I closed the door, trying to convince myself it wasn't important. The next day, I ran into the landlord when I was coming back from work. I mentioned the basement door casually, trying not to sound too weird about it. He seemed surprised, like he hadn't expected me to bring it up. He told me there was a long-term tenant living down there. Some guy who had been renting the basement for years, well before I moved in. He assured me it wasn't anything strange, just an off-grid kind of setup. The whole thing felt off, but the landlord didn't seem too worried. I figured it was just a quirky building with quirky tenants. No big deal. A week later, I ran into the guy. I was coming home late, and he was standing by the building's back entrance, smoking a cigarette. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and this kind of rough look to him, like he hadn't shaved in a while. He nodded at me as I walked past, and I gave a small wave back, feeling a bit awkward. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. It was from him, introducing himself as Greg. Said he was the one living in the basement and wanted to apologize if any of his movements had bothered me. He signed it with a little smiley face, which seemed weird for someone his age, but I thought maybe he was just trying to be friendly. Over the next few weeks, I'd see Craig more often. Sometimes I'd come home, and he'd be sitting on the steps out back, always with a cigarette in hand. We'd chat now and then, just small talk. He seemed harmless enough, but there was something about him that didn't sit right. He'd ask me odd questions, like how long I'd been living alone, if I had many friends in the city, if anyone ever visited. He'd ask them so casually that I didn't think much of it at first, but it started to feel invasive. Like he was gathering information, not just making conversation. One night, I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I heard the noises again. The soft, shuffling footsteps coming from below. But this time, they were louder, like whoever was down there was closer to the stairs. Then I heard something else, a soft knock. It wasn't on my front door. It was coming from the basement door. I sat up, my heart racing. I stayed completely still, listening. The knock came again, more deliberate this time. I waited, hoping it would stop, that maybe I was imagining it. But then, I heard his voice. "Hey, it's Craig. You awake?" I didn't respond. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, listening to him standing on the other side of the door. After a few seconds, he knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're awake. I just want to talk." My mind was racing. Why the hell was he knocking on the basement door in the middle of the night? I didn't answer. I didn't want him to know I was even aware he was there. Eventually, he stopped knocking. I heard his footsteps retreating back down the stairs, and after a few minutes, the building was silent again. The next morning, I found another note under my door. This one wasn't as friendly as the last. It said something like, "Sorry if I scared you last night. I thought we were friends." There was no smiley face this time. I felt sick. There was something seriously wrong with this guy. I wanted to tell the landlord, but what was I going to say? That he knocked on my door late at night? It wasn't exactly a crime. Still, I started keeping the basement door locked after that, not that it made me feel much safer. I started hearing the noises more frequently, the footsteps pacing beneath me at all hours of the night. A few days later, I came home from work and found my apartment door unlocked. I was sure I'd locked it when I left. I walked in cautiously, looking around. Nothing seemed out of place, but the door had definitely been opened. I checked the windows, the back door, everything was shut. That's when I saw it, another note, this time left on my kitchen counter. "I see you've been keeping the door locked. Why are you scared?" "I'm just trying to be nice." That was it. I packed a bag and left that night. I called the landlord the next day, told him I wasn't staying there anymore, that something wasn't right with Greg. The landlord acted like he didn't know what I was talking about, said Craig had always been quiet and kept to himself. But I knew better. I never went back to the apartment. I hired someone to collect my things, and I found a new place in the city. I don't know what Craig wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I still think about those nights sometimes. The way he knocked so softly at first, then harder. How he knew things about me that I hadn't told him. How he was always watching, always asking questions. It started out like a regular thing. I needed a way to get to work, and the idea of carpooling seemed like a good idea at the time. Gas was getting expensive, and taking the train every day was a hassle, so when my coworker, Tom, mentioned that this guy named Doug had been offering rides for people in the area, I didn't think twice about it. Doug was older, maybe in his late 40s, with graying hair and a tired look. When I first met him, he seemed pretty normal. He had one of those old sedans that looked like it had seen better days but ran just fine. He was quiet, didn't talk much during the ride, which I actually appreciated. I'm not a morning person, and I like the peace and quiet on the way to work. The carpool was simple. Doug would pick up me and two other people, Ellen and Rick, at different spots around the neighborhood, and we'd all head to the office together. At first, everything seemed fine. Doug wasn't much for small talk, but he'd sometimes ask about work or make a comment about the weather. Harmless stuff. It wasn't until about a month in that I started noticing small things. Things that didn't seem strange at first but added up over time. Like how Doug always knew exactly where we all were, even when we hadn't told him. One time, Ellen was running late, and she hadn't texted anyone about it. But Doug just said, "Don't worry, we'll wait a few more minutes. She's on her way." Sure enough, Ellen showed up about 5 minutes later. When she got in the car, she apologized for being late, and Doug just smiled and said, "It's all right. I knew you'd make it." It felt a little weird, but I shrugged it off. Then, I started to notice Doug's questions were getting more personal. At first, it was just about our weekend plans or what we were doing after work. But then he'd ask things like, "Do you live alone?" or "How often do you have people over?" It was always in a casual tone, like he was just making conversation, but it made me uncomfortable. I'd give short answers, hoping he'd stop asking, but he didn't. One day, I caught him staring at me in the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure how long he'd been watching me, but when our eyes met, he didn't look away. He just kept staring for a few seconds too long, and then he smiled this small, strange smile that didn't reach his eyes. I looked out the window after that, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It got worse when I realized Doug knew things he shouldn't have known. One morning, he picked me up and said, "How was your sister's visit?" I froze because I hadn't mentioned anything about my sister coming into town. I hadn't told anyone. I asked him how he knew, and he just chuckled and said, "Oh, I must have overheard you talking about it with someone." But I hadn't talked about it at work or during the ride. It was like that with everyone in the carpool. Doug would make these comments about things none of us had mentioned. One time, he asked Rick if he had enjoyed his dinner at that new Italian place downtown, even though Rick hadn't said a word about going there. Rick looked as confused as I felt, but Doug just laughed it off, saying he must have heard wrong. It was starting to get creepy. One evening, Ellen asked if Doug could drop her off at a different location because she was meeting a friend for dinner. Doug agreed but seemed annoyed, even though he didn't say anything. The next morning, when Ellen got in the car, Doug was quiet. Really quiet. When we were halfway to work, he turned to her and said, "So, you didn't end up meeting your friend, did you?" Ellen looked surprised, and then nervous. She hadn't mentioned anything about canceling her plans, but somehow Doug knew. She didn't say much for the rest of the ride, and neither did I. There was something off about the way he said it, like he was watching her, keeping tabs on her for some reason. After that, I started paying more attention. I noticed Doug had this little notebook he kept tucked between the seats. Sometimes, when we'd be stopped at a light or in traffic, I'd catch him glancing at it, scribbling something down. It didn't seem like he was keeping track of directions or anything normal. I couldn't help but wonder what he was writing. The day I decided to stop carpooling came after something that scared the hell out of me. It was a Friday, and we were all riding back home. Doug dropped off Rick first, then Ellen. I was the last one left, which wasn't unusual. But as soon as Ellen got out, Doug didn't follow the usual route to my apartment. Instead, he took a turn that led down this quiet, almost deserted road that I didn't recognize. I asked him why we were going this way, and he just smiled and said, "Thought we'd take the scenic route. It's nicer this time of day." I felt my heart start to race. There was nothing scenic about that road. It was narrow, with tall trees on either side, and hardly any streetlights. I told Doug I wasn't in the mood for a detour and that I just wanted to get home. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his eyes on me in the rearview mirror. The smile was gone. He seemed annoyed. When we finally got back on the main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I made up my mind right then and there that this would be my last ride with Doug. The next morning, I texted the group chat we had for the carpool, saying I wouldn't be riding with them anymore. I didn't give a reason, just said I was going to start taking the train again. Alan responded quickly, asking if everything was all right. I didn't want to get into it, so I just said, "Yeah, all good." A few hours later, I got a text from Doug. I hadn't even realized he had my number. It said, "Saw your message. Are you sure you want to stop? I think it's a mistake." I didn't respond. A few minutes later, another text came through. "I know you. I know you better than you think. Don't make me come find you." I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen. I blocked his number immediately, but the unease didn't go away. I couldn't believe I'd been riding with this guy for months and hadn't noticed how twisted he was. For the next few days, I kept my guard up, making sure to look over my shoulder whenever I left the apartment. I even switched up my commute, taking different routes to the train station to avoid any chance of running into Doug. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe he'd gotten the message and moved on. But then, one night, I came home and found a note slipped under my door. It was handwritten in messy, scrawling letters. It said, "You can't avoid me forever." I felt cold all over. I called the police, but they said there wasn't much they could do without proof of an actual threat. I told them about the texts, but since I'd blocked Doug's number, they couldn't track anything back to him. It was like he'd vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but that note behind. I started staying with a friend after that, too scared to be alone in my own place. I never saw Doug again, but for weeks, I felt like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of someone in the corner of my eye when I was walking home or feel a presence behind me, even though no one was there. Eventually, the fear started to fade, but I never forgot how close I came to something dark. Doug had been watching all of us, collecting details about our lives, keeping track of everything. And the worst part was, I still didn't know why. I haven't carpooled since. It all started a few months ago. I was on one of those chat forums, the kind where you can meet people with similar interests. You know, talk about movies, music, books, whatever. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a way to pass time. That's when I met him. His username was something normal, nothing creepy, Mike 87 or something like that. We got to talking, and honestly, at first, he seemed really nice. We talked about random stuff, shared music recommendations, and joked around. Nothing deep. Nothing weird. After a few weeks, we started messaging outside of the forum, just texting each other. It wasn't anything special, but he seemed to know a lot about the stuff I liked. I didn't think much of it then, but looking back, there were probably some signs. Little things, like how he'd mentioned things about my day before I told him, or how he seemed to know exactly when I'd be free to chat, almost like he was following my schedule. But I brushed it off. I thought, maybe he's just really intuitive or lucky with his guesses. I mean, people are always on their phones, right? Maybe he just knew I'd be around. He never pushed for personal information, never asked for my address or anything. Not right away, at least. One night, we were talking about meeting up. He lived a few states away, and it seemed harmless enough to mention it. I thought, why not? I'd made friends online before, and sometimes it's cool to meet in person. He didn't seem weird at the time, and I thought I was being cautious. I didn't give him my address or anything, just said we could meet in a public place if he ever came to my city. I didn't think much of it after that conversation. A week went by, and we didn't talk as much. He said he was busy with work, and I was wrapped up in my own life. I figured that was that. Until one day, a Thursday, I came home from work and found a note slipped under my door. It wasn't anything threatening, just a folded up piece of paper that said, "Hey, I'm in town. Thought I'd surprise you. Can't wait to finally meet, smiley face, Mike." My heart sank. I never gave him my address. I never even hinted at where I lived. I immediately texted him, asking what the hell was going on, but there was no response. I waited a few hours, hoping he'd explain that it was some kind of joke or maybe a coincidence, but nothing. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every little noise outside my window. I kept my blinds closed and the lights off, too scared to do anything else. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. Every time my phone buzzed, I'd flinch, half expecting it to be him. But there was nothing. Just silence. When I got home, there was another note. This one was different. It was longer and unsettling. "I've been thinking about this for a while," it said. "I feel like I know you better than anyone else. You're the one person who gets me, who really sees me. I can't wait for us to spend more time together. I've been planning something special. That's when I knew this wasn't just some misunderstanding. I was being watched. I was being followed. I called a friend and told her everything, trying to stay calm, but my voice was shaking. She told me to call the police, but I hesitated. What was I going to say? Some guy I met online left me a note. I had no proof he'd done anything illegal. It was just words on a piece of paper. Still, I saved the notes and decided to be more cautious. That night, I couldn't relax. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, even barricaded the front door with a chair. My mind kept running through every conversation we'd had, every detail I might have slipped without realizing it. But I hadn't given him anything. Not my address. Not my schedule. Nothing. So how the hell did he know where I lived? Around midnight, I heard it. A faint knock at my door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe it was just the house settling. But then it came again, this slow, deliberate knock. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The knock came a third time, and then I heard his voice. I know you're in there. I froze. It was him. He wasn't shouting, just talking in this calm, almost friendly tone. Like we were old friends and he was just stopping by for a chat. Come on, he said. Don't be scared. I just want to talk. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My phone was on the table across the room, and I was too terrified to move. For what felt like hours, I sat there, waiting for him to leave, but he didn't. He just kept talking, telling me how he'd been watching me for a while, how he knew we were meant to be together. His voice was so casual, like this was all completely normal. Like I should have known this was coming. Eventually, he stopped talking, but I could still hear him moving around outside. It sounded like he was pacing, maybe trying to decide what to do next. I was praying he'd leave, that he'd get bored or realize I wasn't going to open the door. But then I heard something else. The sound of metal scraping against the lock. I panicked. I grabbed my phone and called 911, whispering to the operator that someone was trying to break into my apartment. I don't even remember what I said, just that my voice was shaking so bad, she had to ask me to repeat myself a few times. While I was on the phone, the scraping stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I kept waiting for him to start again, to hear the door creak open, but there was nothing. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps outside, different ones. Louder. I peeked through the blinds and saw 2 police officers standing near the door. I opened it just a crack, still shaking. They didn't find anyone. Whoever he was gone by the time they got there. They took a statement, told me they'd patrol the area for a few nights, but I knew they couldn't do much. I didn't even know his real name. They suggested I stay somewhere else for a while, maybe with a friend. I nodded, but I didn't leave. I should have. I should have packed my bags and gotten the hell out of there, but I didn't. The next morning, there was another note. It wasn't under the door this time. It was inside. Just sitting on my kitchen counter like it belonged there. I'm disappointed in you. I thought we had something special. Don't make me wait too long. That was it. No signature. No smiley face. Just that cold, unsettling message. I grabbed whatever I could fit into a backpack and left. I haven't been back since. I hired this guy named Frank to do some repairs around my house. It wasn't anything major, just a few things I'd been putting off for years. The roof needed patching, the back deck had rotted out, and a few windows were drafty. Normal stuff. I found Frank through a friend of a friend who said he did good work for a fair price. He looked like a regular guy, maybe in his 50s, with rough hands and a thick beard. He talked like someone who knew what he was doing, so I didn't really think twice about it. At first, everything seemed fine. Frank showed up on time, brought all his tools, and worked quietly. He wasn't one of those guys who blasted music or talked your ear off. He just got to work. I'd be in the house, doing my own thing, and every now and then I'd hear him hammering away or using his saw. No red flags. But after a week or so, I started to notice little things that made me uncomfortable. The first thing was the door to the basement. I hadn't asked him to do anything down there, but one morning I found the door open. I always kept it shut because I never really went down there, and it creeped me out a little. It's an old, unfinished basement, mostly just a concrete hole in the ground. The kind of place that's cold even in the summer. I thought maybe I'd left it open by accident, but it kept happening. Every day, I'd find the basement door cracked open. I asked Frank if he needed anything down there, and he just shrugged and said, "Nope, haven't touched it." I let it slide at first, but then I started hearing things. Scraping noises, like someone dragging something heavy across the concrete floor. It always seemed to happen late at night, after Frank had left for the day. I'd be sitting in the living room, and all of a sudden, I'd hear it this slow, grinding sound coming from the basement. I thought maybe it was the house settling or the pipes acting up, but it didn't feel right. The sound was too deliberate. Too controlled. One night, I got fed up and went down there to check it out. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the basement door, the light from the kitchen spilling into the dark staircase. The scraping noise stopped as soon as I stepped onto the first step. I stood there for a second, waiting to hear it again, but the basement was silent. Just that damp, musty smell coming up from below. I took a deep breath and went down, the flashlight beam bouncing off the concrete walls. There was nothing down there. At least, nothing I could see. The tools Frank had left behind were stacked neatly in one corner, and there were no signs of anything being moved around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the windows, the pipes, everything. But there was nothing. The next day, I decided to ask Frank about it. I tried to be casual, not wanting to sound paranoid. I said something like, "You ever hear weird noises in old houses like this?" He didn't look up from what he was doing, just grunted and said, "Houses settle. Nothing to worry about." His answer bugged me. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Like he was brushing me off. Like he knew more than he was letting on. After that, I started keeping a closer eye on him. I noticed little changes he was making around the house. Things I hadn't asked for. One day, I came home and found that he'd swapped out the locks on the back door. He didn't say anything about it, didn't charge me for it, just did it. When I asked him why, he shrugged and said the old ones looked worn out. I tried to brush it off, but the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. What bothered me the most wasn't the changes he made, it was the feeling that he was in control of the house now. Like he knew more about it than I did. Like he was getting comfortable in it. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not the scraping noise I heard before, these were actual footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from the floor below me. At first, I thought it might be Frank. Maybe he'd come back for something, but then I remembered I'd locked the doors before bed. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The footsteps moved toward the basement door, then stopped. I don't know why, but I got out of bed and grabbed the bat I kept by my nightstand. I didn't turn on any lights as I crept down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. The basement door was wide open. I could see the faint glow of the kitchen light spilling down into the dark stairwell. My hands were shaking as I gripped the bat tighter and called out, "Frank." There was no answer. Just silence. I stepped toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know what was going on. I took a deep breath and headed down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the cold, empty space. When I reached the bottom, I froze. Frank was standing there, in the middle of the basement, staring at the far wall. He didn't turn around when I called his name again. He just stood there, his back to me, like he didn't even notice I was there. I took a step closer and saw what he was looking at. It was a door. A small, wooden door that I'd never seen before. It was set into the far wall, almost hidden behind a stack of old boxes. I'd been in that basement a dozen times, and I'd never noticed it before. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Frank finally turned around. His face was expressionless, like he wasn't even surprised to see me standing there. He didn't answer my question, just walked over to the door and opened it. Behind the door was a small, dark room. I couldn't see much inside, but the smell hit me immediately. It was damp and musty, like something had been rotting in there for years. I took a step back, my stomach turning. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice louder now. Frank looked at me, his eyes cold and hard. "It's where it started," he said, his voice flat. "Or what started?" I asked, but I didn't really want to know. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the room and disappeared into the darkness. For a second, I just stood there, frozen in place. Then I turned and ran. I didn't care what he was doing or why. I just knew I needed to get the hell out of there. I grabbed my phone and called the police, barely able to get the words out through the panic. By the time they arrived, Frank was gone. They searched the house, the basement, and even the strange room behind the door, but they didn't find him. They did find something else, though. The room was filled with old newspaper clippings, all about the house. It had been the site of several disappearances over the years, mostly renters who'd lived there before me. The clippings were yellowed with age, and some of the dates went back decades. The police didn't have any answers for me. They said they'd look into Frank, but they couldn't find any record of him. The friend of a friend who'd recommended him claimed he didn't know the guy that well. Just some contractor he'd hired once. I moved out the next day. I didn't care about breaking the lease or getting my deposit back. I just wanted to get as far away from the house as possible. I don't know where Frank is now, and I don't want to know. All I can say is, if you ever hire a contractor, be careful. You never know who might be watching you. I was on a solo road trip, something I'd wanted to do for a long time. Just me, my car, and a bunch of places I'd pinned on a map that I wanted to see. It felt like a chance to clear my head, and I liked the idea of having no set plans, no schedule. It was late in the summer when I found myself driving through this small town, somewhere up north. I can't even remember the name of it now. There wasn't much there, a couple of diners, a general store, and a gas station. I was getting tired of driving, so I decided to stop for a bit and explore the area. I parked near the edge of town, grabbed my backpack, and started walking. I didn't have any specific destination in mind. There was a trail that seemed to lead toward the woods, and I figured I'd follow it for a while, maybe find a good spot to take some photos. It was peaceful, The kind of place that made you feel like you were miles from anywhere. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows over the trees, but I didn't think much of it. After a while, I noticed a guy walking toward me. He was maybe in his late 40s, dressed in a worn flannel shirt and jeans, the kind of clothes that looked like they'd seen years of hard work. He smiled as he got closer, a friendly enough expression that put me a little at ease. I was usually pretty cautious about talking to strangers, especially when I was alone, but something about him didn't set off any alarms. Not at first, anyway. "Hey there," he said as he got closer. "You're not from around here, are you?" I shook my head. "Just passing through," I replied, keeping my tone light. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer. "We don't get many visitors out here," he said. "Most people just drive on by." "Shame, really. There's a lot of hidden treasures around if you know where to look." I wasn't really interested in a long conversation, but his comment caught my attention. I asked him what he meant by hidden treasures, thinking he was just talking about scenic spots or something. "Oh, you know," he said with a grin. "Old ruins, abandoned places, stuff like that. You wouldn't believe what's tucked away in these woods if you're willing to go off the beaten path a little." I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. I've always been into exploring abandoned buildings and forgotten places. It's one of the reasons I'd set out on this trip in the first place. So, when he mentioned ruins, I felt a flicker of interest. "Do you know where any of that stuff is?" I asked. He smiled again, and this time it felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the way his eyes lingered on me made my skin crawl. Still, he seemed harmless enough, just a local guy excited to share some knowledge. "Yeah," he said. "I can show you a spot. It's not far from here, and I promise you won't find it on any map." I hesitated. Every instinct I had told me not to follow a stranger into the woods, but curiosity got the better of me. I figured if things felt weird, I could always turn back. So, I nodded, and we started walking together. He didn't say much as we made our way deeper into the trees, and the further we went, the more isolated it felt. The trail we'd been on faded away, replaced by a rough, overgrown path that didn't look like anyone had used it in years. The sun was starting to set, and the light filtering through the branches was turning orange and red. I remember thinking that I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and part of me still wanted to see whatever it was he was talking about. After what felt like half an hour of walking, he finally stopped. We were in a small clearing, surrounded by trees that seemed to press in from all sides. There was nothing there, no ruins, no abandoned buildings, just a patch of dirt and rocks. I looked around, confused, and then back at him. "This is it?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, staring at me with that same smile, but now it felt more like he was sizing me up. I took a step back, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "There's a lot of stories about this place," he said finally, his voice low. "Bad things happened here. Kids used to go missing around these parts." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. I'd heard enough. I muttered something about needing to get back to my car and started to turn around, but he grabbed my arm. Not hard, but firm enough that I couldn't just shake him off. His grip was cold, and his smile never wavered. "You're not in a hurry, are you?" he asked, his voice soft, but there was something dangerous underneath it. "I haven't even told you the best part of the story yet." I pulled my arm free and took a step back. My heart was pounding, and all I could think about was getting out of there. I didn't care about being polite anymore. I didn't care if I looked scared. I just wanted to leave. "Thanks, but I really need to go," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't stop me this time, but he didn't move either. He just stood there, watching as I turned and started walking back the way we'd come. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, like he was waiting for me to trip, to falter, so he could swoop in. My legs felt shaky, but I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. I didn't look back until I was sure I was out of sight. When I did, he was gone. I didn't know if that made me feel better or worse. I started walking faster, nearly running, the trees around me closing in like they were part of some sick game. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, convinced he was following me. By the time I made it back to my car, it was almost dark. I threw my backpack in the passenger seat and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As soon as the engine started, I floored it, not caring about the speed limit or the fact that the road was winding and narrow. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. It wasn't until I was halfway to the next town that I realized I'd left something behind. My phone. I must have dropped it somewhere along the way. Panic shot through me, but I wasn't going back. Not for anything. I'd buy a new phone. I didn't care. For the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Every time I stopped at a gas station or a diner, I felt like someone was staring at me, just out of sight. I started sleeping with a knife next to my bed, locking every door and window wherever I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid, but it didn't help. I never went back to that town, and I never told anyone about what happened. I tried to forget it, to push it out of my mind, but every now and then, I catch myself thinking about that guy. Wondering if he's still out there, showing other people hidden treasures. Wondering if any of them ever made it back. I don't really know where to start with this. I guess it all kicked off at the carnival. There was this small traveling fair that set up about an hour outside of town. You know, the type, faded tents, rusty rides that probably shouldn't be running, and sketchy looking vendors calling you over to waste your money. I went with a couple of friends because we didn't have much else to do that weekend, and it was something different. I've never been a big fan of carnivals, but it was fun to hang out, have a few beers, and let loose. We were walking around, hitting up some of the stalls, trying our luck at the rigged games. I'm not usually the type to win these things, but there was this one booth that caught my eye. It was one of those typical knock down the bottles games, except the prizes were weird. Instead of the usual stuffed animals or plastic junk, the shelf behind the counter was full of old dolls, masks, and other strange, creepy things. There was this one prize that stood out. It was this small, handmade wooden doll, about the size of a coffee mug. The paint was chipped, the eyes were two little black dots, and its face was carved into this weird, blank smile. The thing just gave me the creeps, but in a way, I couldn't stop looking at it. I don't know what it was, but something about that doll was drawing me in, even though I didn't want it. So, I paid the guy running the booth. He was this old dude with greasy hair and a tired look in his eyes, barely talking except to take my money. The game wasn't easy, those bottles were weighted down or something, but somehow, I managed to knock them all down on the third try. The old guy didn't seem too happy about it, though. When I pointed at the doll, asking if I could have it as my prize, he hesitated. It was weird. You'd think he'd be glad to get rid of it, but he just looked at me for a second like he was sizing me up before finally handing it over. "Be careful with that one," he muttered, his voice low. I didn't ask what he meant. I just took the doll and stuffed it in my bag. It was all part of the creepy carnival vibe, I figured. We stayed for a bit longer, but the whole night I couldn't stop thinking about that damn doll. My friends kept teasing me about how weird it looked, but I laughed it off. Still, something felt off. It's hard to explain, but it was like carrying that thing around made me uneasy. That night, after I got home, I put the doll on a shelf in my room, thinking I'd just toss it later or give it to one of my friends as a joke. I didn't think much of it until the next day when things started getting weird. It started with my phone. I was getting random messages from an unknown number. At first, it was just gibberish strings of letters and numbers that didn't make any sense. I thought it was spam or some kind of prank, so I ignored it. But then the messages started to make sense. "Do you have it?" one of them said. Then another, "You're next." I tried calling the number back, but it wouldn't go through. I was annoyed, thinking one of my friends was messing with me, so I shot them a group text, telling them to cut it out. None of them claimed to know what I was talking about, which only made me more paranoid. That night, things got worse. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a noise. It was this soft tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door, but it was coming from inside my room. I flicked on the light, and my eyes went straight to the shelf where I'd left the doll. It was still there, sitting exactly how I'd placed it, but now it felt like it was staring right at me. That weird smile looked different, like it was more sinister than I remembered. I got out of bed, grabbed the doll, and shoved it into a drawer. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted it out of sight. I wasn't about to let some stupid carnival toy freak me out. But when I climbed back into bed, the tapping started again. This time, it was louder. I swear it was coming from that drawer. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept checking my phone, but there were no new messages. The next morning, I was exhausted and convinced I was just imagining things, maybe freaking myself out over nothing. So, I tried to get back to normal. I went about my day, went to work, and didn't think about the doll until I got home. That's when I noticed the scratches. There were these tiny, deep scratches all over the top of the drawer where I'd stuffed the doll. It looked like someone had taken a knife and tried to carve into the wood. I opened the drawer, and there it was, just sitting there like it hadn't moved. But I knew something wasn't right. I did some searching online, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and that's when I found an old forum post about the carnival. The post was from years ago, and it was buried deep in the search results, but the title caught my eye. "Has anyone else won the creepy doll at the carnival?" Weird things happening. The guy who wrote it talked about how he'd won the same doll at the same booth, and not long after, he started getting strange messages, too. He mentioned hearing noises, feeling like he was being watched, and how the doll seemed to move on its own. The part that really got to me, though, was the end of the post. He said that the last winner of the doll had disappeared. Just vanished, without a trace. That was enough for me. I wasn't going to wait around and see what happened next. I grabbed the doll and decided I was getting rid of it. I didn't care where, I just wanted it gone. I drove out to the woods on the edge of town and tossed it into a creek, watching as it floated away. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. But when I got home, the messages started again. "You can't get rid of it," the first one said. "Then, it's coming back." I lost it. I drove back to the creek, hoping to find the doll and do something more permanent, but it was gone. I searched the banks, walked up and down the creek for an hour, but there was no sign of it. That night, the tapping started again, but this time it wasn't just inside my room. It was everywhere, on the walls, the windows, even the floor beneath my bed. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it was all in my head, but I knew better. I started staying up late, refusing to turn off the lights. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The messages kept coming, each one more unsettling than the last. "You're next." I don't know how long it went on, but one night, I woke up to something cold against my skin. I froze, too terrified to move, and slowly reached for my phone. When I turned on the flashlight, I saw it. The doll. It was lying next to me in bed, that twisted smile inches from my face. I snapped. I grabbed the doll, ran out into the yard, and threw it into the fire pit. I doused it in lighter fluid and set it ablaze. I watched as the flames consumed it, the paint bubbling and peeling away. I stayed up there until the fire burned down to nothing but ash. That was 3 days ago, and so far, nothing's happened. The messages stopped, and the tapping is gone. But every night, I still check my phone, and every night, I sleep with the lights on. I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Like maybe, somehow, it's still out there. Waiting. I just don't know when it's going to come back. It started like any normal neighborhood potluck. I had been living in the neighborhood for about 6 months at this point. It wasn't the friendliest place, but people waved at each other and said hello when they passed by. Nothing too deep, no close friendships. It was fine, really. I didn't mind keeping to myself. One of the neighbors, Sarah, had knocked on my door a week before the event and invited me to the potluck. She seemed nice enough, kind of the unofficial ringleader of the block. When she asked if I would come, I figured, why not? It'd be a chance to meet more people, and honestly, I'd been feeling kind of lonely since I moved here. The potluck was set up in Sarah's backyard, long tables covered in all kinds of food. I brought a pasta salad, nothing special. People milled around, making small talk, filling their plates. I was mostly keeping to myself, sitting at the edge of the group, not feeling super comfortable yet, but still glad I came. It felt good to be out of the house. After a while, I noticed something strange. It wasn't obvious at first, but after I started looking closer, I realized that almost all of the dishes had meat in them. Like, everything. It wasn't just the usual stuffed burgers or ribs, you know, the kind of thing you expect at a barbecue. It was weird stuff too, like meat and things that usually didn't have it. There was a meat pie, meat in the potato salad, even some weird jello thing with chunks of meat inside. I'm not a vegetarian or anything, but it struck me as odd. It was like they'd all gone out of their way to put meat in every dish. I tried not to think too much about it. I mean, maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe it was some sort of running joke between them that I didn't get. I shrugged it off, grabbed a plate, and started picking through the things that looked the least weird. As I was eating, I noticed that some of the neighbors were watching me. Not in an obvious way, but every now and then, I'd look up and catch someone glancing at me. They'd look away quickly, but it happened enough times that it started to bother me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't know these people well, and it's not like I was the most outgoing person. Maybe I just wasn't used to being around a lot of people. But the more I sat there, the more uncomfortable I felt. Something wasn't right. After about an hour, Sarah came over and sat next to me. She had this big, too friendly smile on her face, the kind of smile that felt practiced, like she'd been putting it on all night. "Are you enjoying yourself?" she asked. I nodded, not wanting to seem rude, but I was starting to get the urge to leave. I glanced down at her plate, and I noticed that she wasn't eating anything. Not a bite. Her plate was full, but untouched. I looked around, and that's when it hit me. None of the neighbors were really eating. They were all holding plates, pushing food around with their forks, but no one was actually eating. At least, not the ones who lived here. I started to feel a knot in my stomach. Something was seriously wrong. I made an excuse about needing to get home, something about having to work early the next morning. Sarah's smile faltered just a bit, like she hadn't expected me to want to leave so soon. But she didn't argue. "Of course," she said, "but before you go, you should really try this." She reached over to the table and picked up a small dish. It was some kind of stew, thick and dark, with chunks of meat floating in it. "This is my grandmother's recipe," she said, her voice soft and warm, like she was offering me some kind of gift. I hesitated, but I didn't want to make a scene, so I took the spoon she handed me and dipped it into the stew. The smell hit me first. It was rich, but there was something off about it, something metallic. I stirred the spoon around, and a piece of meat floated to the surface. It didn't look like any meat I'd ever seen before. I put the spoon down. "I think I'm okay, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah's smile didn't drop, but her eyes did something. They hardened, just for a second, before she pulled the dish back toward her. "Suit yourself," she said, her voice light again, like nothing had happened. I stood up, muttering something about needing to go. As I turned to leave, I saw one of the other neighbors, a man I hadn't met before, standing by the edge of the yard, watching me. He wasn't smiling. He just stared at me, his eyes following me as I walked away. I made it home, locked the door behind me, and sat down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The whole night felt like a bad dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something darker going on. The way they watched me, the way no one ate, the meat in every dish, it was all wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out if I was just imagining things or if there was something seriously wrong with my neighbors. The next day, I did some digging. I didn't even know where to start, but I figured I'd try looking up the history of the neighborhood, see if anything strange had ever happened there. It was a long shot, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't find much at first, just a few mentions of the area in some old news articles. But then I stumbled across an old police report from about 10 years ago. There had been a missing persons case. A woman who had lived in the neighborhood had vanished without a trace. They never found her. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. There were other reports too, more disappearances over the years. None of them were connected, at least not officially, but they all had one thing in common: they had all lived in the same neighborhood. My neighborhood. I was starting to feel sick. I closed my laptop, trying to push the thoughts out of my mind, but I couldn't stop thinking about the potluck. The meat. The way they watched me. I didn't go outside for a few days after that. I didn't want to see my neighbors, didn't want to risk running into Sarah or anyone else. I felt trapped in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. Then, a few nights later, I heard a knock on my door. I didn't answer at first. I just stood there, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock came again, louder this time. I crept toward the window and peeked through the blinds. It was Sarah. She was standing on my porch, smiling that same too friendly smile, holding a dish covered in foil. "I made too much for dinner," she called out, her voice muffled through the door. "I thought you might like some." I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, frozen, as she knocked again, her smile never fading. "I know you're home," she said, her voice taking on a sing-song tone. "Why don't you open the door?" I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. The knocking continued for a few more minutes, then finally, it stopped. I waited, listening, until I heard her footsteps fade away. That night, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't say goodbye. I just got in my car and drove. I didn't care where I ended up, as long as it was far away from there. I don't know what was going on in that neighborhood, but I'm sure of one thing: I was never meant to leave that potluck alive. I had only been teaching at the school for a few weeks when I first noticed him. His name was Ryan, a quiet kid who sat in the back of the room, never said much unless called on, and even then, he barely gave more than a mumble. At first, I didn't think anything of it. You get all kinds of students, and he didn't stand out much except for the fact that he seemed off. I took the teaching job because it was temporary. I'd been between gigs, and this small-town high school was desperate for someone to fill in for their English teacher while she was on maternity leave. I thought it would be a good way to kill time and make some money before finding something more permanent. It wasn't a big school, maybe 200 or 300 kids total, and the town was one of those places where everyone knew each other. Small, quiet, and honestly, a little too isolated for my taste. It wasn't long after I started that Ryan began acting strange around me. At first, it was little things. I'd catch him staring at me during class, his eyes following me as I walked around the room. It was the kind of stare that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, like he was watching me too closely, almost studying me. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe the kid was just shy or had some social issues. But then it got weirder. One afternoon, I was staying late to grade papers. The school was mostly empty, just a few janitors cleaning up and a couple of other teachers working in their classrooms. I didn't hear him come in, but when I looked up from my desk, Ryan was standing in the doorway. He didn't knock or say anything, just stood there, staring at me like always. "Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Do you need something?" He didn't answer right away, just kept staring. After a few seconds, he spoke, his voice low and almost monotone. "Do you like teaching?" The question threw me off. It was so random, so out of the blue, and the way he asked it didn't feel like small talk. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess I do." He didn't respond, didn't move. Just stood there, eyes locked on me. I felt this creeping unease settling in, and I cleared my throat. "Is there something you need, Ryan?" Without answering, he turned and walked out of the room. I sat there for a minute, staring at the empty doorway, my heart beating a little faster than it should have been. I told myself I was overreacting, that he was just a weird kid. But something about the way he looked at me stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. A few days later, things escalated. I was walking out to my car after school when I saw him again. This time, he was standing in the parking lot, just a few feet from my car, watching me. The rest of the students had already left, and the lot was mostly empty. The sight of him just standing there, waiting, sent a chill down my spine. I tried to act normal as I approached my car. "Hey, Ryan," I said, forcing a smile. "Do you need a ride home or something?" He shook his head, still not saying a word. His eyes never left me, like he was expecting something, waiting for me to do or say something specific. I unlocked my car and got in, my hand shaking a little. As I started the engine, Ryan didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, his face blank. I drove away as quickly as I could, glancing in my rearview mirror the whole time. He was still standing there, watching until I was out of sight. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those cold, unblinking eyes. It was like he was trying to tell me something without words, something I didn't want to hear. I thought about talking to the principal, but what could I even say? "One of your students is staring at me too much?" It sounded ridiculous. The next day, I tried to avoid him, but it didn't matter. Ryan was waiting for me after class again, this time closer, just outside the door. I didn't say anything to him, just walked past, pretending I didn't notice. But I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the back of my head. That night, I decided to do a little digging. I hadn't really asked about Ryan when I started, but now I was curious, maybe even a little desperate to understand why he was acting this way. I asked one of the other teachers, a woman named Miss Davids, if she knew anything about him. She gave me a strange look when I brought him up. "Ryan?" she asked. "Yeah, I know him. He's had some trouble at home." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, feeling a knot of unease forming in my stomach. She hesitated, glancing around like she didn't want to be overheard. "His family's a bit off. They live way out in the woods, on the edge of town. People around here don't really talk about them much, but there have been rumors for years. His dad's got a reputation. Not a good one." "What do you mean?" She sighed, lowering her voice. "There have been stories about abuse, weird behavior. Some people even say his dad's involved in something illegal, but no one's ever been able to prove anything. Ryan doesn't talk about it, but it's pretty obvious something's not right." I left that conversation feeling more unsettled than ever. If Ryan's home life was that bad, it could explain some of his behavior, but it didn't make me feel any better about the way he was acting around me. Over the next few days, Ryan's fixation on me seemed to intensify. He was always there, always watching. He never spoke unless I addressed him, but his eyes never left me. I started feeling like I was being hunted, like he was waiting for the right moment to do something, though I didn't know what. Then, one night, things took a turn for the worse. I was leaving school late again, after staying to finish up some grading. The parking lot was dark, only a few streetlights illuminating the area. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, and there he was, Ryan, standing a few feet away, staring at me just like before. But this time, there was something different in his expression. His face wasn't blank anymore. There was something in his eyes, something dark and focused, like he'd finally made up his mind about something. "Ryan," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "You can't keep following me like this. It's not appropriate." He didn't respond, just took a step closer. My heart was racing now, and I took a step back, instinctively moving toward my car. "You need to go home," I said, my voice shaking. "It's late." He took another step closer, his eyes locked on mine. I could feel the panic rising in my chest. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a troubled kid with a rough home life. There was something much darker going on here, something I couldn't understand. I turned and bolted for my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to unlock the door. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quickening as he followed. I barely managed to get the door open and jump inside before he reached me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could hardly breathe. Ryan stood outside my car, his face inches from the window, staring at me with those cold, unblinking eyes. He didn't try to open the door, didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me, his breath fogging up the glass. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I started the car and sped out of the parking lot, my heart pounding in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching as I drove away. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went straight to the principal and told him everything. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. Something was seriously wrong with Ryan, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. The principal listened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He said he'd look into it, talk to Ryan's parents, but I knew nothing would come of it. The town had been ignoring that family for years, and they weren't going to start caring now. I quit the job the next day. I got the first call late one night, around 11:30. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I figured maybe it was a friend who had lost their phone or someone from work, so I answered. The voice on the other end was low and rough, like he'd been smoking for years, and he asked for someone named Carrie. "Sorry," I said, still half asleep. "You've got the wrong number." There was a pause, and then he said, "No, I don't think I do." That's when I hung up. I thought it was some creep messing around, maybe drunk. I brushed it off and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the sound of his voice. There was something off about the way he said it, like he knew something I didn't. I told myself it was nothing. Just some guy who got the wrong number and didn't want to admit it. But the next night, around the same time, my phone rang again. Same number. I stared at it for a few seconds, thinking about letting it go to voicemail, but my curiosity got the better of me. I answered. "Carrie, you there?" he asked right away. "I told you yesterday, you have the wrong number," I said, more annoyed than anything. "I don't know a Carrie." This time, there was no pause. "I think you do," he said, his voice cold. "And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my voice steady. "Look, I'm not who you're looking for. Stop calling me." I hung up again and blocked the number. I sat there in bed, staring at my phone, feeling uneasy. This didn't feel like a wrong number anymore. It felt like something else, something worse. But I still didn't want to think too much of it. People were weird, and this could just be a prank. I told myself that the blocked number would solve it, but the next night, my phone rang again. Unknown number this time. I hesitated, but I answered. "Carrie," the voice rasped. "You can't hide forever. We know what you did." My throat tightened. "I'm not Carrie," I snapped. "You have the wrong person. Stop calling me." The voice laughed, low and menacing. "You're not very good at lying." I hung up again, my hand shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Who the hell was Carrie? And why did this guy think I was her? Was it really just a mistake, or was something else going on? Over the next few days, the calls kept coming. Always from different numbers, always late at night. No matter how many times I blocked them, they found a way through. Each time, the voice grew more aggressive, more insistent. He would say things like, "You think you can run from this, and you should have kept your mouth shut." It was like he was convinced I had some kind of secret, something I was hiding, and no matter how many times I told him I wasn't this Carrie person, he wouldn't believe me. I started feeling paranoid. Every time my phone buzzed, even for a normal text or call, I jumped. I kept checking my windows, my locks, thinking maybe this guy wasn't just calling. Maybe he was watching, waiting. The fear started to gnaw at me, making it hard to focus at work, hard to sleep. I told a couple of friends, but they just shrugged it off, said it was probably some random creep. "Don't answer," they said. "Block the number. It'll stop eventually." But it didn't. One night, after another call, I decided to dig a little. I Googled Carrie, along with a few of the phrases the guy had been saying, thinking maybe it would lead to something. I didn't expect to find anything, but then I stumbled across a news article from a few months ago. A woman named Carrie had gone missing in a town not too far from mine. She'd been involved in some legal trouble, something about a fraud case, and then she'd just disappeared. No one had seen her since. My stomach dropped. Could this be the Carrie he was looking for? Was this guy connected to her disappearance somehow? And why the hell was he calling me? I thought about going to the police, but what could I even say? Some guy keeps calling me, thinking I'm someone else. It wasn't exactly enough to file a report. So, I decided to wait it out, hoping that if I didn't answer the calls, they'd stop. But they didn't stop. They got worse. One night, my phone rang again, and before I could think, I picked it up. "Carrie," the voice said, his tone sharper this time, more urgent. "We're coming for you. You better be ready." I froze. "I'm not Carrie," I said, my voice shaking. "You've got the wrong person. Stop calling me." There was a long pause on the other end, and then he said, "You're lying." I hung up, my heart racing. This was getting out of control. I didn't know who this guy was or what he wanted, but he wasn't going to stop. I could feel it. The next day, I went to the police. I told them about the calls, about the guy thinking I was someone else, about Carrie. They listened, but there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd look into it, but without any real evidence, they couldn't track the calls. I left the station feeling more frustrated than ever. It was like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare, and no one could help me. That night, I got another call. This time, the voice was different. It wasn't the man I'd been hearing for weeks. It was a woman. Her voice was quiet, shaky. "Carrie," she said, her words barely a whisper. "You need to get out. They know where you are." I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'm not Carrie," I said, my voice cracking. "Please, stop calling me." "They don't care," she said. "They think you know. They think you're involved. You have to leave." I hung up, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if the call was real, if it was another sick joke, or if it was someone trying to warn me. But either way, I was scared. Really scared. The next few days were a blur. I started keeping my phone off at night, too afraid to answer it. I barely left my apartment, jumping at every sound, every knock on the door. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was just waiting for the right moment to show up. Then, one night, everything came to a head. I was sitting on my couch, trying to distract myself with TV, when I heard a noise outside. It was faint, just a soft thud, but it was enough to send my heart racing. I got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek outside. There was a car parked across the street, its headlights off. I couldn't see who was inside, but I had a feeling I knew. My stomach churned with fear. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. As I waited for the dispatcher to pick up, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number. My heart stopped. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I let it ring, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The dispatcher picked up, and I told them about the car, about the calls, about everything. They said they'd send someone over. I hung up and waited, my eyes glued to the window. The car was still there, just sitting in the dark, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I felt trapped, like a rabbit caught in a snare, with no way out. Minutes later, the flashing lights of a police car lit up the street. The car across from my apartment took off, its tires screeching as it sped away. The cops didn't catch it, but they stayed with me for a while, taking my statement, telling me they'd keep an eye on the area. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel a little safer. For now. The call stopped after that. I don't know if the guy got scared off, or if he finally realized I wasn't the person he was looking for. But I moved a week later, got a new number, and made sure I wasn't easy to find. I never did find out what happened to Carrie, or who that man was, but I hope to God I never have to hear that voice again. My car broke down about 30 miles from the nearest town. It was late afternoon, and I had been driving down this old back road to avoid the highway, hoping to shave off a bit of time. Not many people used it, but I figured it was safe enough. I'd driven it before, though never this late. The engine just cut out. No warning, no weird sounds. 1 minute I was driving, and the next, the car just died. I pulled over to the side, put it in park, and tried to start it again, but nothing. Not even a click. It was like the battery had disappeared. I checked my phone, hoping to find service, but there was nothing. No bars, not even a flicker of reception. I was stuck. I sat there for a while, trying to figure out what to do. It was getting darker, and I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. I remembered passing a gas station about 20 minutes back, so I decided to try walking in that direction, hoping to find someone who could help. Before I could get out of the car, though, a truck came down the road. It was an old, beat-up thing, the kind you see in movies about serial killers, but I was desperate. I waved my arms, hoping the driver would stop. He did. The man who got out was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and had a cigarette dangling from his mouth. He looked rough, like he'd been working with his hands all his life. His clothes were dirty, stained with oil or grease, and he had this blank expression that made me uneasy. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I nodded. "Yeah, it just died on me. I don't know what's wrong with it." He scratched his chin and looked at the car. "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I can take a look if you want." Part of me wanted to say no, to just wait for someone else, but what were the odds of another car coming down this road anytime soon? I was stuck, and he was offering help. I didn't really have a choice. "Sure, that'd be great," I said, trying to sound casual. He walked over to the hood and motioned for me to pop it. I did, and he leaned in, fiddling with something for a while. I stood there, feeling the sweat start to form on my back. The air was getting cooler, but the tension in my body made me feel like I was overheating. After a few minutes, he stood up and wiped his hands on his pants. "Looks like your alternator's shot," he said. "You're not going to get this thing started without replacing it." My heart sank. "Is there any way you can fix it?" He shook his head. "Not out here. But I can give you a lift into town, get a tow truck to come pick it up." Something about the way he said it made me pause. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he looked at me, like he already knew what I was going to say. But what else could I do? I couldn't stay out here all night. "Okay," I said. "Thanks." He nodded and gestured toward his truck. "Hop in." I grabbed my backpack from the car, locked the doors, and followed him to the truck. It smelled like cigarette smoke and something else, something metallic and sour. I tried not to think about it as I climbed into the passenger seat. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound coming from the rumble of the truck's engine and the crackle of the old radio playing some country station. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying not to look at him. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "Where are you headed?" he asked after a few minutes. "Just passing through," I said. I was on my way to visit family. He grunted but didn't say anything else. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something. We weren't heading toward the gas station. We weren't even heading toward town. We were going deeper into the woods, down a road I didn't recognize. I think we're going the wrong way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He glanced at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Shortcut," he said. My stomach tightened. "Are you sure?" "I don't remember this road." He didn't answer. That's when I started to panic. I reached for my phone, hoping to at least get a signal, but there was still nothing. I was trapped in this guy's truck, in the middle of nowhere, and I had no idea where he was taking me. I tried to stay calm, thinking of what to do next. If I freaked out, he'd know I was onto him, and I didn't want to give him a reason to act sooner than he'd planned. I glanced at the door handle, wondering if I could jump out, but we were going too fast, and I didn't want to risk breaking something or worse. After another few minutes, he slowed down and pulled off onto a dirt road. The trees were thick here, the branches hanging low, almost blocking out the fading sunlight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. "We're almost there," he said, his voice calm. "Almost where?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked. He didn't answer. I knew then that I had to get out of there. I couldn't wait any longer. My hand hovered over the door handle, and I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He was staring straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As soon as the truck slowed to take a sharp turn, I yanked the door open and jumped out. I hit the ground hard, rolling to avoid the impact, and scrambled to my feet. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't stop. I ran into the woods, the sound of the truck's engine fading behind me. I could hear him shouting, his voice angry and close, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, dodging trees and branches, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. The woods were thick, and it was getting darker, but I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know how long I ran before I finally stopped, my legs burning and my chest heaving. I collapsed behind a fallen tree, trying to catch my breath, my heart racing. I listened, straining to hear any sign of him, but there was only silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The sun had set by now, and the woods were pitch black. My phone was useless, and I had no idea where I was. Eventually, I started moving again, slowly, carefully, trying to find my way back to the road. Every sound made me jump, every rustle of leaves sending my heart into overdrive. I was sure he was still out there, looking for me, waiting for me to make a mistake. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled onto the road. It was empty, no sign of the truck or the man. I started walking, limping from the pain in my leg, hoping to find someone, anyone who could help. It wasn't until hours later, when I finally reached a small town, that I felt safe enough to stop. I found a diner that was still open and called the police. They came, took my statement, and searched the area, but they never found the man or his truck. I don't know what his plan was, and I don't want to think about it. All I know is that I was lucky to get out when I did. I had been looking forward to the networking event for weeks. It was supposed to be a chance to connect with people in my field and maybe even open some doors for my career. The venue was a sleek, modern space filled with bright lights and chatter. Everyone was dressed sharply, and I felt a mix of excitement and nerves as I made my way through the crowd. I grabbed a drink and started chatting with a few people. They were friendly, sharing stories about their jobs and experiences. I was starting to feel more at ease when I noticed a small group gathered near the back of the room. They were speaking in hushed tones, their expressions serious. My curiosity got the better of me, and I drifted closer. I heard snippets of their conversation. Words like the police, witness, and silence sent a chill through me. I leaned in a little more, trying to catch every detail. They were discussing a recent crime or robbery that had escalated, and someone had been hurt. One man, tall and built, was talking about how anyone who knew anything needed to keep quiet. He had a tense look in his eyes, and I could feel the weight of his words. I stepped back, my heart racing. This was serious. I didn't want to get involved, but I couldn't help but think about how I might share what I overheard later, maybe even with the police. But as I turned to leave, I bumped into someone. It was a man, mid-30s, with a sharp suit and an even sharper gaze. "Hey there," he said, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. "What's got you looking so serious?" I forced a smile back. "Oh, just overheard some interesting talk over there." I gestured vaguely toward the group. His expression shifted slightly, and I noticed how his gaze hardened. "Interesting? Or dangerous?" The way he asked sent a shiver down my spine. "Just interesting," I said, my voice wavering slightly. "Careful what you overhear," he replied, leaning a bit closer. "Some things are better left unsaid." I felt a rush of panic. His tone was warning, but it also had an edge that suggested something darker. I wanted to walk away, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded slowly, but his eyes never left mine. It was as if he were assessing me, gauging my reaction. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. I tried to shake off the encounter, but my heart was racing. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my phone to text a friend, but I couldn't focus. My hands were shaking. I decided to step outside for some air. The night air was cool against my skin, but it did little to calm my nerves. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and it was the man from earlier, walking toward me with purpose. "Thought I'd find you out here," he said, his voice low and smooth. "You really should be careful." I forced myself to keep my expression neutral. "I'm fine." "Are you?" He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You know, people have a way of disappearing when they start asking questions they shouldn't." Panic flooded my veins. I took a step back, wanting to distance myself. "I'm not asking anything. I just came to this event to meet people." He chuckled softly, but it felt empty. "Right. Just a regular networking event. You're not getting involved, are you?" Because that would be unwise. I wanted to say something, to defend myself, but my throat felt tight. My instinct screamed for me to get away from him. I glanced around, hoping to see someone, anyone, who could help. The street was mostly empty. The event had pulled most people inside. "Listen," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm just going to go back inside." He stepped forward, blocking my path. "Not yet. I think we need to have a little chat first." Fear coursed through me, and I felt a surge of adrenaline. I was done playing along. I took another step back, then turned to run. My heart raced as I sprinted down the sidewalk, the sound of his footsteps behind me growing louder. I didn't look back. I dashed toward the parking lot, hoping to find my car. My mind raced with thoughts of what he might do if he caught me. I had to get away. I reached my car and fumbled for my keys, panic making my hands clumsy. Just as I unlocked the door, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, and there he was, standing just a few feet away. His face was hard, and I could see the anger in his eyes. "You shouldn't have run," he said, his voice cold. "Leave me alone." I shouted, adrenaline giving me a burst of strength. I jumped into the car and slammed the door. My heart pounded as I locked it, and I quickly turned the key in the ignition. He stepped closer, and I could see him reaching for the door handle. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking space, not caring if I hit anything. I didn't look back as I sped out of the lot, my heart racing with fear and relief. I drove without a clear destination, just wanting to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. I finally pulled over on a deserted road, trembling. I took a moment to catch my breath, my hand shaking against the steering wheel. The fear began to subside, replaced by a sense of determination. I couldn't let him intimidate me. I needed to tell someone what I heard and what happened. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. When I finally spoke to the operator, I recounted everything I had overheard and how the man threatened me. They assured me they would send someone to investigate, but I knew I couldn't go back to that event or let my guard down. I got home and locked the doors, making sure every window was secure. I stayed up late, heart still racing, thinking about the people at that event, the conversations I overheard, and how close I had come to a terrible situation. I reported everything to the police the next day. They took my statements seriously and assured me they would look into it. I never went back to that networking event, and I was careful about the connections I made after that. That encounter changed something in me. I learned to trust my instincts, to be aware of my surroundings. Sometimes, the smallest thing can lead to something dark, and it's better to walk away before it's too late. I've always liked camping alone. It's something about the quiet, the stillness, being away from everyone and everything. People say it's weird for a woman to go out into the woods by herself, but I never saw it that way. I've done it plenty of times, and nothing ever happened. This time was no different, or at least, it didn't start out that way. I planned to stay for a weekend, just me, my tent, and enough food to last a couple of days. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far enough from any roads or trails that I wouldn't run into other campers. That was the point, to be alone. The first day was fine. I set up my tent, built a fire, and spent the day hiking around. There wasn't much to see except trees and the occasional stream, but that's what I liked about it. It was peaceful. I didn't have to talk to anyone, didn't have to worry about anything. As the sun went down, I got back to my campsite, cooked some food, and settled in for the night. It was cold, but I was prepared for that. I had a thick sleeping bag, extra blankets, the works. The fire crackled beside me as I sat there, watching the stars appear overhead. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard something. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it was there. Voices. I froze, listening. It wasn't the kind of noise you expect to hear out there, miles away from anyone. It sounded like a conversation, though I couldn't make out any words. It was coming from somewhere far off, maybe deeper in the woods, but close enough that I could hear the low murmur of it. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me. It was late, I was tired, and the woods can make all sorts of strange noises when you're alone. Still, it bothered me. I sat up straighter, straining to hear it again. For a while, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling the leaves. But then, I heard it again. Louder this time. Definite voices. I stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it in the direction the sound was coming from. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, the same as before. No people, no movement. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded shaky, but I forced myself to speak louder. "Is someone out there?" Silence. The voices stopped, and all I could hear was the wind again. I stood there for a long time, just listening, my heart pounding in my chest. But after a few minutes, the woods were quiet again. I went back to my fire, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe some campers further out than I thought. But it didn't sit right with me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise outside my tent made me jump. I kept my flashlight close, the zipper of the tent slightly open so I could peek out if I needed to. But nothing happened, and eventually, I drifted off. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that something felt wrong. The air felt colder, heavier. I sat up, blinking in the early light, and that's when I realized my fire was out. Not just burnt down, but completely cold, like it had been out for hours. That's when I saw the footprints. They were everywhere, all around my tent. I could see them clearly in the dirt, circling the campsite, overlapping in places. There had to be at least 3 or 4 sets of them, all leading in different directions, as if whoever had made them had been walking around my tent for hours. I felt my stomach drop. My first thought was that someone had been watching me while I slept. The voices from the night before came rushing back into my head, and I stood up, my heart racing as I looked around the campsite. That's when I noticed my supplies were gone. Not everything, just enough to make it unsettling. My food, my extra blanket, my water bottle. All of it was gone, but my tent and sleeping bag were untouched. It was like someone had come in during the night and taken what they needed, without waking me. I searched the area, looking for more signs of whoever had been there. The footprints led off into the woods in every direction, like they'd scattered after taking my things. I followed one set for a while, but they just disappeared after a few yards, as if whoever made them had just vanished. I went back to my campsite, trying to stay calm. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. It could have been other campers, sure, but why would they take my things and leave everything else? Why didn't they wake me up or say something? I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed up my remaining gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into my backpack. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. By the time I was ready to leave, the sun was higher in the sky, but the woods still felt off. The air was too quiet, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. I started hiking back towards my car, keeping a tight grip on my flashlight even though it was daylight. Every little sound made me jump at the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, following me. About halfway back to the trailhead, I heard it again. The voices. They were faint, just like the night before, but they were there. Low, murmuring, like a conversation just out of earshot. I stopped dead in my tracks, listening. The voices seemed to be coming from up ahead, deeper into the woods. But I couldn't see anyone. The trail was empty, just trees and underbrush as far as I could see. I didn't want to go any further, but I didn't have a choice. My car was still a good hour's hike away, and there was no way I was going to turn back and spend another night out there. I kept moving, faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. The voices seemed to follow me, getting louder as I went. I couldn't make out any words, but I knew they were talking about me. I could feel it. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the trailhead. My car was parked just beyond it, in the small clearing where I'd left it. Relief washed over me as I picked up my pace, almost running the last few steps to the car. But as I reached the clearing, I stopped short. There, standing beside my car, was a man. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face partially hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. He didn't move, just stood there, staring at me as I approached. I froze, my hand tightening around the strap of my backpack. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The man didn't say anything. He just kept staring. I took a step back, my heart racing. "What do you want?" Still nothing. I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and ran back down the trail, not caring where it led, just needing to get away. I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and fast, but I didn't dare look back. I just ran, branches whipping against my face, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I don't know how long I ran for, but eventually the footsteps faded, and I found myself alone in the woods again. I never went back to that car. I'd been planning this hike for months. My job was wearing me down, and I needed a break from everything, so I decided to take a week off and head to the Rockies. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing crazy, just me, some gear, and nature. I'd done a few solo hikes before, but nothing as remote as this. Still, I figured I could handle it. I liked the quiet, the solitude. I set out early that morning. The trail I picked was marked as moderate, and I wasn't expecting any surprises. The first few miles were pretty standard, well-trodden paths, occasional signs to remind you where you were. I passed a couple of other hikers, but for the most part, it was just me. The sun was high by the time I hit what I thought was the halfway point. I stopped to take a break, eat something, and get my bearings. The map showed a small stream about a mile further ahead, so I figured I'd refill my water there. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There was a rope tied to a tree, just off the main path. At first, I thought it was some kind of marker, maybe left by another hiker or part of some trail maintenance. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't just a random rope. It was thick, old-looking, and it led deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I wasn't sure what to make of it. It didn't seem like something you'd see in a national park. I stood there for a minute, debating if I should follow it. In hindsight, I should have just kept walking, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the rope for about 10 or 15 minutes, winding through trees and brush. It wasn't easy to keep track of, but every time it looked like it might stop, I'd find another piece tied to a different tree, leading me further in. That's when I came across the first marker. It was a small wooden sign, nailed to a tree, and it had an arrow pointing down a narrow path. The writing was faded, but I could make out something that looked like a name. I don't know why, but something about it gave me the creeps. It didn't seem official, like it wasn't meant to be there. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I kept walking, following the signs and ropes deeper into the forest. After a while, I realized the path wasn't natural. It was man-made, like someone had cut it out of the trees and bushes. It wasn't a trail you'd find on any map. That's when I saw the first trap. I nearly walked right into it. It was a snare, hidden under some leaves and branches, with a thin wire stretched between two trees. If I hadn't been looking down at the time, I would have tripped right into it. I stepped back, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would someone set a trap out here? It didn't make any sense. This wasn't hunting season, and even if it was, this wasn't the kind of trap you'd use for animals. It was too deliberate, too well hidden. It felt wrong. I took a few steps back, trying to calm myself down, but then I noticed something else. There were more traps. I could see them now, scattered along the hidden path, each one different from the last. Some were snares, others looked like pits, covered with loose brush. Whoever had set these traps wasn't just trying to catch animals, they were trying to catch something bigger. Something human. I turned around, ready to head back to the main trail, but then I heard a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, straining to hear if it was just an animal, but then I heard it again. It was closer this time. I didn't see anyone, but I knew someone was there. I could feel it. My instincts were screaming at me to get out of there, so I started walking back the way I came, faster now, trying not to make any noise. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every rustle of leaves felt like a gunshot. As I made my way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that someone was following me. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there. I didn't run. I didn't want to set off any of the traps I hadn't noticed, but I moved as quickly as I could, hoping I wasn't too far from the main trail. That's when I saw it. Another rope, tied between two trees, blocking my way back. It wasn't there before. I was sure of it. Someone had set it while I was following the path. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. If I went under it, I'd be right in their line of sight. If I went around, I'd be moving into unknown territory. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, partially hidden behind the trees, watching me. I couldn't make out their face, but they were tall, wearing dark clothes. They didn't move, didn't say anything, they just stood there, watching. Panic set in. I couldn't go back the way I came, and I couldn't stay where I was. I had to keep moving, keep looking for a way out. I veered off the path, into the dense underbrush, trying to lose them, but every time I thought I was alone, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves, and I'd know they were still there, following me. It felt like hours, but eventually, I stumbled back onto the main trail. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just kept walking, fast, trying to put as much distance between me and whatever was back there. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if they were still watching. When I finally made it back to my car, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, driving as fast as I could. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I'm not going back there. I've tried to look up information about the area, but I haven't found anything. No reports of strange activity, no missing hikers, nothing. It's like it never happened. But I know what I saw. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere. It was an old sedan, so it wasn't exactly a surprise, but it was still frustrating. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town before dark, and I thought I could push it a bit further. Then the engine started sputtering, and before I knew it, the whole thing just died. There was nothing around me except fields, and I couldn't even see any houses. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The only thing I had going for me was a gas station I remembered seeing a few miles back. I grabbed my water bottle, locked the car, and started walking. It wasn't long before I reached the station. It was old, the kind that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. There was a single pump and a small building with a sign that just said gas. I was hoping there'd be someone inside who could help me. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside, a guy sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He was in his 50s, maybe, wearing greasy coveralls like he'd been working on cars all day. When he looked up, he smiled and asked what he could do for me. I explained my car had broken down a few miles away, and he nodded like it happened all the time. "You're in luck," he said. "I'm the mechanic here too. Let's take a look." We hopped into his truck, and he drove me back to my car. He seemed friendly enough, chatting about the weather and how quiet things were around here. When we got to the car, he popped the hood, poked around a bit, and then told me he'd need to tow it back to the station. He hooked it up to his truck, and we headed back. At first, I felt relieved that I'd found help so quickly. I figured I'd be back on the road in a couple of hours. But as we got back to the gas station, something started to feel off. He took the car around back to his garage, which was behind the station. I followed him inside, and that's when I realized how isolated this place really was. There were no other cars, no people coming and going, just us. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows around the station stretched out, making everything feel a little more sinister. He said the engine was pretty bad and that it would take a while to fix. I asked if there was somewhere nearby I could stay for the night, and he just shook his head. "Not much around here," he said. "You're better off waiting here." That's when things started to change. He wasn't as friendly as before. His tone was different, a bit colder. I tried calling a tow service or another garage, but my phone still didn't have a signal. I asked if I could use his landline, and he told me it was down. "Storm knocked it out last week," he said. I started to feel trapped, but I didn't want to cause any trouble. I sat in the small waiting area inside the station, flipping through an old magazine while he worked on my car. The hours dragged on. I looked outside, and it was pitch black. I couldn't hear anything except the occasional clanging from the garage. At one point, I went out to check on him, and he snapped at me. "I told you, it's gonna take time," he said, not looking up from the engine. His face was different now, harder, meaner. I didn't like the way he was acting, but I didn't know what to do. My car was in pieces, and I was miles from anywhere. When I went back inside, I noticed something strange. There was a phone behind the counter. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out. If the landline was down, why was it still there? I wanted to ask him about it, but something told me not to. As the hours passed, my anxiety grew. Every time I checked on the car, it seemed like he wasn't making any progress. In fact, it almost looked like he was undoing things, making the problem worse. I started to feel like he didn't want me to leave. At one point, I overheard him talking to someone on the phone in the back. It was muffled, but I caught enough to know he was lying to me. He had a working phone. He was telling someone that I was here, stuck. That's when I knew I had to get out. I waited until he went back to the garage and then quietly went behind the counter to grab the phone. I was shaking, but I managed to dial 911. It rang twice before I heard a click, and then nothing. Just silence. No operator, no sound. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. It was like someone was intercepting the call. I looked out the window and saw him standing there, staring at me through the glass. He wasn't smiling anymore. He just watched me for a few seconds, then went back into the garage. I was panicking now. I didn't know who he was talking to, but it didn't feel right. I started looking for something I could use as a weapon, just in case. The only thing I found was a rusty tire iron near the front door. I sat there, clutching the tire iron, waiting. Every noise made me jump. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the wind outside, it all felt too loud, too close. I didn't want to confront him, but I knew I couldn't stay there much longer. My only hope was that someone would come by the station and help. Hours passed, and no one came. It was well into the night when he finally came back inside. His hands were greasy, and his face was set in that same hard expression. "Car's gonna need a part one don't have," he said. "You're stuck here until I can get it." I knew he was lying. I could feel it in my gut. But I didn't say anything. I just nodded and told him I'd wait. He stared at me for a long time before walking out the door again. I watched as he disappeared into the darkness outside. That's when I made my move. I grabbed my bag and the tire iron and slipped out the back door. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I ran into the night, through the fields behind the station, praying I wouldn't hear him coming after me. The darkness was suffocating. I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me, but I kept going, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how far I'd gotten when I heard a truck engine in the distance. I crouched down in the tall grass, holding my breath. The headlights of his truck swept across the field, searching. He was looking for me. I stayed as still as I could, my body trembling. The truck passed by, and I heard it drive off into the distance, but I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I got up and started walking again, staying off the road, cutting through fields and wooded areas. I walked for what felt like hours until I finally saw lights in the distance. It was another gas station, and this one had people. I stumbled inside, barely able to speak, but I told the clerk what had happened. They called the cops, and I waited for them to arrive. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, looking for me. The police found my car back at the station, but the mechanic was gone. They told me they'd keep looking for him, but I never heard anything after that. I had been traveling with Emily for over a week by the time she decided to visit the town. We had planned a long trip, mostly staying in small places, exploring local areas, keeping things low-key. The day she left for the nearby town, I stayed back at the little guest house we rented. It was more isolated than I expected, but we had been looking for quiet, so I didn't think much of it at first. She had texted me a few times when she got to the town, just simple things like what she was doing, places she was visiting, and how she thought it was charming. I didn't feel like going with her that day. I was tired from our earlier hikes, so I spent the day reading and resting, expecting her back by the evening. But that night, she didn't return. I texted her to check if everything was okay, and I didn't get a reply. At first, I figured she was just still enjoying herself. Maybe she met some people or got caught up exploring. I went to bed, thinking she'd come in later or early the next morning. The next morning came, and her bed was still untouched. I sent her more texts, just checking in, asking where she was. I called her phone, but it went to voicemail every time. That's when I started to feel uneasy. Emily wasn't the type to disappear like that. She always told me what she was doing. Even if she stayed out late, she would have let me know. I decided to head to the town myself, figuring I could find her or at least someone who saw her. It wasn't far, just a short drive through the countryside. The town was small, not many people around. I parked and started walking, stopping at the cafe she mentioned. The barista said they remembered her from the day before, but she hadn't been back since. I walked around the town for hours, asking shop owners, random people on the street, anyone who might have seen her. Some people remembered her, others didn't. But no one knew where she went. It was like she vanished after that. I went to the local police station, thinking they might be able to help. The officer at the front desk seemed disinterested, though. He took my information, asked a few basic questions, and told me they'd keep an eye out. But it didn't feel like enough. I left the station feeling more unsettled than before. Days passed, and there was still no sign of Emily. I stayed close to the guest house, hoping she'd show up or call. But nothing. I tried calling her phone again and again, leaving messages, but it never rang through. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought about what might have happened to her, where she could be. On the third night after she went missing, I got a text from her phone. It was late, almost midnight. The message just said, "I'm fine. Be back soon." I should have felt relieved, but something about it felt wrong. The wording, the way it was phrased, it wasn't how Emily talked. I texted back right away, asking where she was and why she hadn't called. I didn't get a reply. I stared at the phone, waiting, feeling my heart pound in my chest. An hour passed, and then another message came. Don't worry about me. Just stay where you are. The longer I stared at the message, the more unsettled I felt. Emily never spoke like that, not to me. She was always casual, friendly, full of little jokes or emojis in her texts. But these messages were stiff, too formal. I called her phone again, and it went straight to voicemail. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. I tried to convince myself it was just her being weird, maybe playing a prank or trying to mess with me, but it didn't feel like that. I texted back, asking her again where she was. No response. The next morning, I drove back to the town, thinking maybe I could find her or at least figure out what was going on. I retraced the places she had been, the streets she mentioned in her earlier texts. But everything felt strange now. People in the town were colder, more distant. They seemed to avoid eye contact, barely answered when I asked questions. It was like they were shutting me out. I went back to the police station and told them about the texts, but the officer shrugged it off, saying if she was texting, she was probably fine. But she wasn't fine, I knew it. I could feel it in my gut. I left the station frustrated, unsure of what to do next. Later that day, I got another text. Stop looking for me. Just go home. That wasn't Emily. I was sure of it now. The messages were getting stranger, more direct. I texted back, asking who this was, demanding they tell me where she was. Nothing. I spent that night pacing the room, my phone in my hand, waiting for another message. Just after midnight, it came. You need to leave. I stared at the words on the screen, my heart pounding. I texted back, asking again where Emily was, who was sending these messages. But the reply that came a minute later made my blood run cold. We know you're still here. I felt frozen in place, staring at the screen. Who was we? I ran to the window, looking out into the darkness, but there was nothing. No cars, no lights, just the empty road and the sound of the wind. I double-checked the door, making sure it was locked, then sat on the bed, gripping my phone, trying to think of what to do. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept hearing small noises outside the guest house, footsteps, whispers carried by the wind, but every time I looked, there was no one there. The messages kept coming, more frequent now. Each one felt more threatening, like whoever was sending them was watching me, getting closer. Leave now. You're not safe. By dawn, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and left the guest house without looking back. As I drove out of town, my phone buzzed one more time. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The message read, "You're next." I felt sick. I floored the gas pedal, desperate to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop driving for hours, not until I was back in a bigger town with other people around. I didn't know what to do. Emily was still missing, and I couldn't go back. I didn't know who was sending those messages, but I knew they weren't her. I went to the police in the new town, told them everything, showed them the texts. They promised to look into it, but they didn't seem to believe me. They said it was probably a misunderstanding, that Emily had just left, and someone was playing a sick joke. But I knew better. Something was wrong in that town, something that no one wanted to talk about. I still don't know what happened to Emily. Her phone stopped sending messages after that, and no one has seen her since. I've tried to move on, but the memory of those texts haunts me. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear my phone buzz. I grab it, half expecting to see another message. But there's nothing. Just silence. And that silence is almost worse. I booked the cabin as a last-minute getaway. It was one of those places you find on those rental sites, advertised as secluded and perfect for unwinding, which was exactly what I needed. Life had been rough the last few months. Work was hell, and I was going through some personal stuff, so when I saw the pictures of this cozy little place tucked away in the woods, it felt like a sign. The price was cheap, too, almost suspiciously cheap, but I figured it was just because it was off-season. When I got there, it looked just like the photos. A small cabin, nothing fancy, but it was clean and well kept. The trees around it were thick and tall, giving the whole area this peaceful, quiet vibe. There wasn't another house or cabin in sight. It was exactly what I wanted. The first night was fine. I settled in, made myself some dinner, and sat on the porch with a drink, listening to the wind through the trees. I didn't hear anything else. No animals, no cars in the distance, nothing. Just silence. It was strange at first, but I liked it. The kind of quiet you don't get in the city. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the area. There was a small path that led into the woods, so I followed it, figuring I'd explore a bit. About an hour into the hike, I came across a clearing. In the middle of it was a car, an older model SUV, covered in leaves and dirt, like it hadn't been moved in weeks. I walked up to it, thinking maybe it belonged to someone staying in a nearby cabin, but when I got closer, I realized there was something off about it. The windows were dusty, and the inside looked like it had been abandoned. There were a few things scattered in the back seat, some clothes, an empty fast food bag, but no sign of anyone. I knocked on the windows, called out to see if anyone was around, but the place was dead quiet. I didn't want to pry, so I just left it. Maybe someone had left their car there and was hiking around. I wasn't sure, but it didn't seem like my problem. That night, back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the weird feeling I got from seeing that car. I tried to forget about it, but it kept creeping back into my mind. Why would someone leave their car like that in the middle of nowhere? It was strange, but not exactly alarming, at least, not yet. I spent most of the evening inside, reading and trying to relax. But the silence that had felt so peaceful the first night was starting to get under my skin. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was too quiet. Like the kind of quiet that feels wrong, like the world had stopped moving outside. Before bed, I did something I don't usually do. I looked up the place online, curious to see if anyone had mentioned anything strange about it in reviews. Most of them were pretty standard, people talking about how great it was, how peaceful, how they loved the hiking trails. But then I found one review, buried among the others, that mentioned something that stuck with me. It was from a couple who had stayed at the cabin a few months back. They said they had an amazing time, but toward the end of their stay, they saw a car parked on one of the trails that led deeper into the woods. They didn't think much of it at first, but when they got home, they realized the car had been there for days, maybe even weeks, without moving. They tried to reach out to the owner, but never got a response. The weirdest part? The couple never returned home after that trip. The rental site had marked their reservation as no-show for the next booking, and the cabin had sat empty until I came along. Reading that made my skin crawl. The car they described, it had to be the one I saw. I told myself it was just a coincidence. People disappear for all sorts of reasons. Maybe they got lost, or maybe something else happened. But the fact that the car was still there, that the couple had never come back, made me uneasy. The next day, I went back to the clearing. The car was still there, exactly where I'd seen it. This time, though, I decided to take a closer look. I opened the door, and the smell hit me immediately. It wasn't overpowering, but there was something stale about it, like old food left in a closed space for too long. Inside, there were more signs that whoever had been there left in a hurry. An open suitcase in the back, with clothes spilling out. A couple of water bottles in the cup holders, half empty. But no sign of the people who had packed those bags, or drank from those bottles. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone leave all this behind? Why hadn't anyone come to check on the car? I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I'd even tell them. Hey, I found this abandoned car in the middle of the woods, and I think it might belong to people who disappeared. It sounded insane. That night, things got worse. I went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside the cabin, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the kind of sounds you expect in the woods but somehow felt wrong. Like they were too close, too deliberate. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something walking around out there, just out of sight. At one point, I got up to check the windows, and that's when I saw it. Out in the distance, near the tree line, there was a light. Just a small, flickering light, like a lantern or a flashlight. It was moving slowly, bobbing up and down as if someone was walking with it. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Who would be out there in the middle of the night? The nearest cabin was miles away, and the trail wasn't exactly popular. The light moved closer, just for a moment, before it stopped. And then it went out, leaving nothing but darkness. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the window, waiting to see if the light would come back. It didn't, but the feeling that someone was out there didn't go away. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay there another night. Something wasn't right. I packed up my things as quickly as I could and got ready to leave. But as I was loading my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt, just outside the cabin, were footprints. Fresh ones, leading from the woods right up to the door. They weren't mine. They were too large, and they were spaced in a way that suggested someone had been walking slowly, deliberately. I got out of there as fast as I could, but the whole drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see someone or something following me. I never reported the car. I didn't even tell anyone about what I'd seen or what I thought might have happened. It felt too crazy, too unbelievable. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Something happened to those people, and I was lucky enough to get out before it happened to me too. I rented a boat to spend a peaceful day on the lake. It was a serene morning, and the water was calm. I was looking forward to a day of fishing in solitude. I set out around 8 a.m., with a cooler full of snacks and my fishing gear. The sun was shining, and everything felt perfect. The lake was quiet. I anchored the boat in a secluded spot where I could cast out and relax. I spent the first few hours fishing, enjoying the tranquility. I hadn't seen another boat all day, which was just the way I liked it. Around 6 p.m., as the sun began to set, I noticed another boat approaching. It was a small, speedboat, and it seemed to be coming directly towards me. There were 3 people on board, a man, a woman, and another man. They were all waving and smiling. I thought they might be lost or just looking for a friendly chat. When they pulled up alongside my boat, they introduced themselves. They seemed friendly enough and asked if I was having a good day. I said I was and offered them some snacks, but they declined. The man then asked if I wanted to join them for a drink. I was hesitant but agreed, thinking it would be nice to socialize a bit. The woman helped me climb over into their boat. As soon as I was on board, I noticed that their boat was much larger and more luxurious than mine. They offered me a drink, which I accepted. The conversation started off light and casual, but I began to feel uneasy when they started asking more personal questions. I tried to steer the conversation back to neutral topics, but they kept probing. They asked where I lived, what I did for work, and if I was alone. Their questions seemed more invasive with every minute. I noticed that the sun had almost set, and it was getting dark. I started feeling uncomfortable and decided it was time to head back to my boat. I thanked them for their hospitality and said I needed to get going. That's when things took a turn. The man who had been quiet suddenly stood up and said, "Why don't you stay a bit longer? It's getting dark, and the water can be dangerous." I tried to insist on leaving, but the woman moved closer and said, "We're not in a hurry. It's best if you stay with us." I could feel the change in their demeanor. The atmosphere had become tense, and I realized they were not as friendly as they seemed. I looked at my boat, now a good distance away. I tried to make my way back, but the other two men blocked the path. They exchanged glances and seemed to be silently communicating. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I tried to remain calm, thinking of a way to get back to my boat. I said I had an important call to make and needed to use my phone. One of the men handed me his phone. I pretended to make a call while quietly trying to think of a plan. As I was on the phone, I suddenly reached for the small emergency whistle I had with me, which I kept in a pocket of my jacket. I gave it a quick blow, hoping someone might hear it. The men seemed to notice, but they didn't react immediately. I started to make my way back to the edge of their boat. I told them I needed to use the restroom. The man who had been quiet followed me, making sure I didn't stray too far. I used the opportunity to grab the rope that was tied to my boat and started to untie it. As I finished, I noticed the other two men looking at me with growing suspicion. I made a break for my boat, and as I climbed over, I could hear them shouting. I quickly started the engine and began to move away from their boat. They followed for a short distance, but as I gained speed, they eventually stopped chasing me. I could still see their boat in the distance as I made my way back to the dock. I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the dock, I told the staff what had happened. They called the authorities, and the police were able to investigate the area. I stayed at the dock until they gave me the all-clear. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I was grateful to be safe and vowed to be more cautious in the future. I realized how quickly a peaceful day on the lake could turn into a nightmare. I had been out with friends at a bar, and by the time I decided to call it a night, it was already late. I ordered a rideshare to get home. The bar was a bit out of the way, so I was relieved when the car pulled up on time. It was a regular sedan, and the driver greeted me with a polite smile as I got in. I said my address and we started driving. At first, everything was fine. The driver was making small talk, asking about my night and telling me a little about his own. It was friendly enough. I answered briefly, too tired to engage much. I wanted to get home and go to bed. The route was familiar, and I felt comfortable enough. We got onto the highway, and the driver turned off into a residential area that was not part of my usual route. I thought maybe there was some traffic on the highway, and he was taking a detour. But then, he made a sharp turn onto a road I didn't recognize. That made me sit up a bit straighter. I checked the GPS on my phone. We were clearly not heading towards my home. I tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just lost or making a mistake. I looked at the driver through the rearview mirror, but his expression was focused and calm. He didn't seem like he was in any sort of distress. I started to feel uneasy. I asked him, "Excuse me, I think you might have missed my turn." He didn't respond immediately. He kept driving, and that's when I noticed something even more alarming. The doors were locked. I tried to open the door, but it was firmly shut. I started to panic. My mind raced with thoughts. I tried calling my friend to tell her what was happening, but there was no signal. I was stuck. I had never felt so vulnerable. I didn't want to make the driver angry or provoke him, so I tried to stay calm. I asked him again, "Can you please tell me where we are going? This isn't the way to my house." This time, he glanced at me through the mirror, but his eyes were cold. He didn't say anything. The car kept moving, and I could see that the buildings outside were becoming more sparse. I looked around frantically, trying to figure out where we might be. There were no familiar landmarks, no street signs I recognized. My heart pounded as the car continued to drive deeper into a more isolated area. I started to think about how to escape, but the car was moving too quickly. I noticed a small house up ahead, and I thought maybe there was a chance to get help if I could get out. I had to act quickly. I grabbed my phone and tried to use it to call 911, but I still had no signal. My throat felt dry, and I could barely think straight. I watched as the driver slowed down near the house, and for a moment, I thought he might stop there. But instead, he just kept driving past it. I realized then that this was deliberate. He wasn't lost, he knew exactly where he was going. The car continued down the road, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I noticed the driver was glancing at me occasionally through the mirror. It was clear he was aware of my growing fear. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't planning to drop me off at home. I had to come up with a plan. I looked around again, spotting a few cars parked along the road. I decided that if we stopped for any reason, I would have to act fast. I considered how to get out of the car in an emergency, but the locked doors made it difficult. The driver turned onto a dirt road. The car jolted as it drove over uneven terrain. I knew I had to do something soon. I glanced at the driver again, trying to gauge his intentions. He wasn't showing any signs of aggression, but his lack of communication and the locked doors were enough to make me extremely anxious. Finally, the car stopped in a secluded area near some trees. The driver put the car in park and turned off the engine. I could feel my heart racing. This was my chance. I needed to make a move before it was too late. I took a deep breath and said, "Please let me out. I want to get out of the car now." My voice shook, but I tried to keep it steady. The driver didn't respond. I reached for the door handle, trying to unlock it manually, but it was no use. I saw the driver reaching for something under his seat, and that's when I knew I had to act fast. I decided to make a run for it. I pulled on the door with all my strength, and finally, the lock gave way. I pushed the door open and stumbled out of the car. I ran towards the trees, hoping to find some cover. I heard the driver yelling something behind me, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached the road. I finally saw headlights in the distance and waved frantically. A car stopped, and I ran up to it. The driver of the car let me in and called the police for me. I was shaken and scared, but I was safe. The police arrived shortly and checked the area, but the rideshare driver was gone. They took my statement and advised me to stay safe and be cautious with rideshares in the future. I got home later that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind. It was the scariest experience of my life. I still get anxious whenever I think about rideshares now,